In the shadows of Queens, New York, a man lived by a rule older than the streets themselves. For almost 90 years, Vincent Asaro walked a path that led him through the biggest robbery in American history. A murder trial, betrayal by his own family, and a not guilty verdict that shocked the nation. This is the story of the last true Goodfella, a man who never broke omerta, even when everyone around him did. Before we dive deep into Vinny's amazing journey, I want to know, where in the world are you watching from right now? Drop your city and the time in the comments below. And if you're settling in for this full story tonight, hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Trust me, you'll want to follow along for every twist and turn. Now let's begin where it all started. On July 10th, 1935, in the working-class neighborhood of Ozone Park in Queens, New York, a boy was born who would become the picture of everything the American Mafia was, both its romantic stories and its brutal truth. Vincent Asaro entered a world where the line between legal and illegal, right and wrong, was not drawn by society's laws, but by a much older rule, the Code of La Cosa Nostra, our thing. Ozone Park in the 1930s was a neighborhood of narrow streets, brick row houses and corner stores where everyone knew everyone else's business, or at least they thought they did. The area was full of Italian and Sicilian immigrants who had come to America, looking for opportunity, but often found themselves pushed aside, treated unfairly, and forced to create their own ways to make money to survive. Within this community, organized crime wasn't seen as the enemy of the people. In many ways, it was the people's answer to a system that had rejected them. Vincent's family didn't just live in this world. They helped create it. His grandfather had been among the early members of what would become known as the Bonanno crime family, one of the 5 families that would control organized crime in New York City for most of a century. His father followed in those footsteps, making a living through different businesses that existed in the gray areas and dark corners of American capitalism. For young Vincent, crime wasn't something you chose. It was something you were born into, like the color of your eyes or the shape of your face. Vincent's childhood was different from that of most American boys. While other children learned about George Washington and Abraham Lincoln as their heroes, Vincent learned about men with nicknames like Joe Bananas and the Chin. While other families gathered around the dinner table to talk about baseball scores and school grades, the Asaro household had whispered conversations about territory, respect, and the importance of keeping your mouth shut. The neighborhood itself was Vincent's school. The social clubs that lined the streets, places where men seemed to gather to play cards and talk about the old country, were actually headquarters for criminal businesses. The restaurants where families celebrated weddings and christenings were the same places where men made drug deals and planned robberies. The difference between real business and organized crime was so blurry, it was almost not there, but it would be wrong to paint Vincent's upbringing as all dark or without normal childhood experiences. He played stickball in the streets, went to Catholic school where nuns hit his knuckles with rulers when he misbehaved, and felt the same joys and frustrations as any working-class kid growing up in New York. The difference was that Vincent also learned another set of lessons, one not taught in any school. He learned that loyalty was more important than truth. He learned that respect had to be earned through action, not words. He learned that some fights couldn't be settled in courts or by police. They had to be handled personally, decisively, and often violently. Most importantly, he learned the principle of omerta, the code of silence that was the foundation of mafia culture. Omerta wasn't just about not talking to police. It was a complete way of life. You didn't share your business with outsiders. You didn't involve regular people in matters that didn't concern them. You handled your problems within the family, and the family handled its problems internally. To break omerta was to commit the worst betrayal. It was to become a rat, an informant, something lower than the lowest criminal. For Vincent, Being born into a mafia family came with huge pressure. He wasn't just Vincent Asaro, an individual person with his own dreams. He was Vincent Asaro, grandson and son of made men, carrier of a family tradition that stretched back to Sicily, representative of a way of life that was under constant threat from police and rival. Families alike. This pressure shaped him in basic ways. From an early age, Vincent understood that he was being watched and judged. His behavior reflected not just on himself, but on his father, his grandfather, the entire Asaro name. A show of weakness, cowardice, or disloyalty could bring shame not just to Vincent, but to generations of his family. At the same time, Vincent had access to privileges and protections that most kids in Ozone Park could only dream of. His family's connections meant he was untouchable on the streets. Other kids knew not to mess with Vincent Asaro. Local business owners knew to treat the Asaro family with respect. Police officers, many of whom were paid off by the mafia, knew to look the other way when it came to certain activities. This created a strange split in Vincent's character that would last his whole life. On one hand, he was part of a special, powerful organization that operated above the normal rules of society. On the other hand, he was trapped in a system with its own strict order, its own brutal rules, and its own harsh punishments for those who stepped out of line. As Vincent moved through his teenage years and into young adulthood, his education in the ways of the mafia became more formal and intense. By his teenage years, he was running small jobs for made members of the Bonanno family, delivering messages, picking up payments, acting as a lookout during meetings. These tasks might seem small, but they were actually important tests of Vincent's reliability and secrecy. The older members of the organization watched carefully to see how Vincent handled himself. Did he arrive on time? Did he follow instructions exactly? Most importantly, did he keep his mouth shut about what he saw and heard? In the mafia, a young man's reputation was built through these small actions. Long before he was ever considered for membership, Vincent passed these tests perfectly. He showed the qualities that the organization valued: reliability, secrecy, respect for the chain of command, and a willingness to do what needed to be done without asking unnecessary questions. He also showed that he had his family's personality. He could be friendly when he needed to be, but he also had a temper and wasn't afraid of a fight. By the time he was in his 20s, Vincent was no longer just the grandson and son of mobsters. He was becoming a mobster in his own right, building his own reputation within the Bonanno family. The streets of Ozone Park that had been his playground as a child were now his territory, the place where he would make his mark and build his criminal empire. But Vincent's education in the ways of the mafia was about to take a darker turn. He was about to learn that loyalty and respect came with a price measured in blood. To understand Vincent Asaro's rise through the ranks of the Bonanno crime family, you must first understand the structure and culture of La Cosa Nostra itself. The American mafia, despite its reputation for chaos and violence, was actually a highly organized and structured group with clear ranks, rules, and steps. At the top of each family sat the boss, the ultimate decision maker, whose word was law within the organization. Below the boss was the underboss, second in command. The consigliere served as counselor and advisor, often settling fights and giving strategic advice. Below these top positions were the caporegons or captains, each controlling a crew of soldiers who carried out the family's various criminal businesses. The Bonanno family, one of the original 5 families started by Lucky Luciano in the 1930s, had a particularly interesting history. Named after Joseph Joe Bananas Bonanno, the family had been involved in everything from selling illegal alcohol during Prohibition to drug trafficking, gambling, loan sharking, and labor racketeering. By the time Vincent was coming up through the ranks in the 1960s, the Bonanno family controlled important territory in Brooklyn, Queens, and parts of Manhattan. For Vincent, Entering this world as more than just the son of a connected guy meant proving himself worthy of membership. This process, known as making your bones, required showing absolute loyalty, ability, and willingness to do whatever the family required, including murder. Vincent's climb through the organization during the 1960s and 1970s was marked by a mix of inherited advantage and personal skill. His family connections gave him opportunities, but he had to prove he could take advantage of those opportunities. Just being the grandson of a respected member wasn't enough. Vincent had to show that he had the intelligence, toughness, and good judgment to be a valuable part of the organization. He started by mastering the traditional mafia businesses. Loan sharking, the practice of lending money at very high interest rates, required a mix of money, record keeping, and the willingness to use violence against those who failed to pay. Vincent proved good at all three. He understood that successful loan sharking wasn't just about threats. It was about reading people, understanding who would pay and who wouldn't, knowing when to show mercy and when to make an example. Gambling operations, another basic part of mafia income, required different skills. Running illegal betting operations meant managing information, keeping things secret, and paying off the right people to avoid police trouble. Vincent showed he could handle the complexity of these operations while keeping the low profile that was essential for long-term success. Extortion, often made to sound fancy in movies as selling protection, was perhaps the ugliest of the traditional mafia businesses. In practice, it meant threatening business owners with violence or property damage unless they paid regular tribute. Vincent became skilled at this practice, understanding that the key was to take enough to make money, but not so much that the businesses failed. You couldn't collect from a business that had been driven into bankruptcy. Through these activities, Vincent built relationships with other members of the organization. He became known as someone who could be trusted, someone who followed orders without question, someone who understood the code and lived by it. These relationships were the currency of the mafia, more important than money, more valuable than territory. The mafia's success as an organization rested on its rules, and Vincent learned them thoroughly during these early years. These rules were passed down by word of mouth, never written, part of a tradition that stretched back to Sicily and the secret societies that had resisted various foreign rulers for centuries. Rule 1. Omerta, above all. Never work with authorities under any circumstances. This wasn't just about avoiding arrest. It was about keeping the organization's mystery and power. The mafia's greatest strength was that police could never fully get inside, could never get reliable testimony about its operations. Rule 2. Respect the chain of command. Orders came from above and were to be followed without question. Taking action was valued, but refusing to follow orders was a death sentence. This strict order prevented chaos and made sure the organization worked smoothly, even when individual members were arrested or killed. Rule 3. Keep family business within the family. Don't discuss operations with outsiders. Don't bring unnecessary attention to the organization. Don't involve regular people unless absolutely necessary. The mafia survived by keeping separation between the criminal world and the legal world, even as it operated in both. Rule 4. Personal loyalty beats everything. Your duties to the family came before duties to your actual family, before personal wealth, before your own safety. This rule is perhaps the hardest for many members to follow, but it was also what made the organization so powerful. Members knew that betrayal would be punished, not just against them, but against their entire families. Rule 5. Respect was earned through action. Talk was cheap in the mafia. Reputation was built through deeds, through successful operations, through standing firm under pressure, through handling problems efficiently and quietly. Vincent understood this naturally and made sure his actions spoke louder than his words. The 1960s and 1970s were a time of big change in the American Mafia. The old certainties were being challenged by new realities. The FBI under J. Edgar Hoover had finally admitted that organized crime existed and was putting significant resources into fighting it. New laws, particularly the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, which wouldn't be passed until 1970, were being made to target not just individual criminals, but entire organizations. At the same time, the traditional mafia strongholds in city ethnic neighborhoods were changing. Italian Americans were moving to the suburbs, becoming doctors and lawyers and businessmen. The new immigrants in neighborhoods like Ozone Park were from different countries, different cultures, and they didn't necessarily respect the old power structures. The drug trade, which the mafia had traditionally avoided because of the harsh federal sentences it carried, was becoming too profitable to ignore. This created tension within the organization between traditionalists who worried about bringing increased police attention and younger members who saw the huge profits to be made. Vincent navigated these changes by staying flexible while staying true to core principles. He understood that the specific businesses might change from bootlegging to gambling to drugs, but the basic model remained the same. Find an illegal or almost legal market. Control access to that market. Use violence or threat of violence to maintain control. And above all, keep silence and discipline within the organization. The exact details of Vincent's formal entry into the Bonanno family as a made member stay unclear, protected by the very code of silence that defined his life. What is known is that becoming a made member, being straightened out in mafia language, required taking part in a murder. This requirement served multiple purposes. It showed absolute commitment to the organization. It gave the organization power over the new member. They could always reveal the murder if the member turned informant. And it was a test of nerve and ability for Vincent. This moment came at some point in the 1960s. The victim, the circumstances, the method, these details are lost to history, protected by omerta. What matters is that Vincent proved willing to cross that final line, to take a human life in service to the organization. After this act, he was no longer just Vincent Asaro, connected guy from Ozone Park. He was Vincent Asaro, made member of the Bonanno crime family, a soldier in an army that had been at war with society and itself for decades. The entry ceremony itself, as later informants have described, was a serious ritual. The candidate would be brought to a secret location, usually a private home or social club, in a room with closed blinds and locked doors. The senior members of the family would be gathered. The candidate's finger would be pricked, his blood smeared on the image of a saint. He would swear loyalty to the family above all else, accepting that to betray the organization meant death. The saint's image would be burned while the candidate held it, a reminder that he should burn like this saint if he ever broke his oath. For Vincent, this ceremony was the high point of everything his life had been building toward. He was now part of something bigger than himself, part of a brotherhood that stretched across continents and generations. But he had also sealed his fate. There was no way out of the mafia except in a coffin. The oath he had taken was not just symbolic. It was real and binding. Being a made member brought privileges. Vincent now had a seat at important meetings. He had a say in how operations were run. He was entitled to a percentage of various criminal businesses. Other criminals, both inside and outside the organization, had to treat him with respect. The local police, many of whom were paid off by the mob, knew to be careful with him, but it also brought huge responsibilities and dangers. Vincent was now a target. If the FBI could flip him, could get him to testify, they could take down important parts of the organization. Rival families saw him as an enemy. Even within his own family, Vincent had to be careful. Fights over money, territory, or respect could quickly turn deadly. More than that, Vincent now lived in a world where he could never fully trust anyone. Was his closest friend wearing a wire? Was his business partner stealing profits? Was that stranger at the bar an undercover agent? Paranoia wasn't a mental illness in the Mafia. It was a survival skill. Yet Vincent seemed to do well in this environment. Those who knew him during this time described a man who was confident, capable, and committed to the life he had chosen. He understood the risks and accepted them. He knew the rules and followed them. Most importantly, he believed in the code, or at least he seemed to dot by the end of the 1970s. Vincent Asaro had established himself as a respected member of the Bonanno family. He had his own crew, his own operations, his own reputation. He had proven his loyalty, his capability, and his secrecy. But he was about to become involved in events that would define not just his life, but the entire history of organized crime in America. Before we get to that, though, there was another matter that Vincent had to take care of. A matter that would remain buried, literally, for more than 40 years. If there was a moment when Vincent Asaro crossed from being a criminal to being something darker, something harder to explain, it was likely in 1969 with the murder of Paul Katz. This was not a killing in the heat of the moment. Not a matter of self-defense or even a business fight that got out of hand. This was planned murder carried out with calculation and buried with the assumption that it would remain hidden forever. Paul Katz was not a mobster or rival criminal. He was a businessman, someone who moved in the gray areas where real business and organized crime met. According to later testimony, Katz had become suspected of being an informant, of passing information about criminal activities to police. In the paranoid world of the Mafia, such suspicions were basically a death sentence. The problem with being suspected of being an informant was that there was no real way to prove your innocence. Denials meant nothing. Of course, a rat would deny being a rat. The very suspicion was enough, especially in an organization where the penalty for being wrong was much less severe than the penalty for letting a real informant continue operating. On a day in 1969, Paul Katz was tricked into coming to a location in Queens under some false reason, perhaps a business meeting, perhaps a social gathering. He had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. He might have even considered Vincent and the others who were present to be friends, or at least friendly business partners. What happened next was brutal and efficient. According to later court testimony, Katz was strangled with a dog chain. This method of killing was not chosen by chance. It was personal, close, requiring the killers to watch their victim die slowly, to feel the life drain out of him. A gunshot would have been quicker, cleaner, but also louder and more likely to attract attention. Strangulation was the Mafia's preferred method for killings that needed to be quiet and contained. Vincent was present for this murder, taking part alongside James "Jimmy the Gent" Burke, a famous criminal who would later be connected to many murders and who would serve as the inspiration for Robert De Niro's character in the film Goodfellas. The presence of Burke is important. He was a feared figure in the criminal underworld, known for his intelligence, his brutality, and his absolute intolerance for anyone who might work with police. After Katz was dead, the body had to be gotten rid of. This was always the messy part of murder, the part where criminals made mistakes that could lead to their capture. Bodies could be identified. Bodies could provide scientific evidence. Bodies could be found by regular people who would call the police. The solution was to make the body disappear completely. Katz's body was taken to a location in Queens where it was buried. The exact location would remain a secret for more than 40 years, known only to the handful of people who took part in the murder and disposal. The burial site was chosen carefully, somewhere that was unlikely to be disturbed, somewhere that wasn't going to be built on or dug up anytime soon, for Vincent and the others involved. Burying Paul Katz's body was like burying their own humanity. This wasn't a killing in war or in self-defense. This was the cold-blooded murder of a man who might not have even been guilty of the thing they suspected him of. And even if he was an informant, there was a cruel irony to it. They killed him to protect the organization's secrets. But in doing so, they created a secret that would eventually lead to the organization's exposure. The mental impact of taking part in such a murder is hard to understand for those who haven't crossed that line. Vincent was not a psychopath who felt no guilt. By all accounts, he was capable of normal human emotions. He had a family, friends, people he cared about. But he had also accepted that violence was sometimes necessary in his line of work, that tough decisions had to be made, that the organization's survival depended on harsh punishment being given out to those who threatened it. This way of thinking, that the murder was necessary, that it was business, not personal, that Katz had brought it on himself by being, or being suspected of being, an informant allowed Vincent to live with what he had done. In the Mafia's moral world, loyalty was the highest good and betrayal the worst sin. If Katz had indeed been an informant, then his murder was not just okay, but required. If he wasn't an informant, well, that was too bad. But better to be safe than sorry. For more than 40 years, the murder of Paul Katz remained hidden. The body stayed buried, the secret stayed kept, and Vincent went on with his life and his criminal career. Police suspected that Katz had been murdered. People don't just disappear without a trace, but suspicion wasn't proof. Without a body, without witnesses willing to testify, without any physical evidence, there could be no court case. This was omerta in action. Multiple people knew about the murder. Multiple people knew where the body was buried, but nobody talked. Not to police, not to prosecutors, not even to journalists who might have paid a lot for such information. The code of silence held firm year after year, decade after decade, but secrets have a way of coming out eventually. The longer a secret is kept, the more people who know about it, the more likely it becomes that someone will eventually break the silence. In the case of Paul Katz's murder, that silence would eventually be broken, not by guilt or by police pressure, but by the most painful betrayal Vincent would ever experience, a betrayal by his own blood. For now. Though, in 1969, the secret was fresh and the burial was complete. Vincent had proven himself capable of the final act of loyalty to the organization. He had murdered a suspected informant and helped get rid of the body in a way that suggested it would never be found. In the eyes of his fellow mobsters, this made Vincent even more trustworthy, even more reliable, even more of a stand-up guy. Living with murder is different from living with other crimes. Robbery, extortion, even drug dealing. These crimes have victims, but they're abstract, distant. Murder is close and permanent. The person you killed is gone forever because of your actions. Their family grieves. Their friends wonder what happened to them. And you carry that knowledge with you every day for the rest of your life. For Vincent, the murder of Paul Katz was just one of many violent acts in a violent life. It's likely there were others made members of the Mafia didn't typically stop at one murder. But Katz's killing was different because the body stayed hidden for so long. Because it became the basis for one of the major charges that would eventually be brought against Vincent. And because its eventual discovery would start a chain of events that would threaten to destroy everything Vincent had built. In the immediate time after, Vincent had to act as if nothing had happened. He had to go about his daily routine, interact with people normally, show no sign of guilt or stress. This compartmentalization, the ability to commit extreme violence and then return to normal life, is a skill that successful criminals develop. It's also deeply damaging to the soul, creating a kind of split where the person shows one face to the world while hiding a darker self. Underneath, some criminals crack under this pressure. They start drinking heavily, using drugs, becoming erratic or paranoid. Others, like Vincent, seem to handle it by simply accepting it as part of their chosen life. You want to be in the Mafia? You want the money, the power, the respect? Then you accept that sometimes you'll have to do terrible things. It's the price of admission. The murder of Paul Katz was not a single event in Vincent's life, or in the life of the Bonanno family. It was part of a pattern of violence that was everywhere in organized crime. The Mafia settled its fights through violence. It enforced its rules through violence. It maintained its power through the threat of violence. This violence fell into several types. There was strategic violence, murdering rivals, killing informants, getting rid of people who threatened the organization. There was punishment violence, beating or killing members who broke the rules or showed disrespect. There was show violence, public acts meant to send a message to others. And there was almost casual violence, the beatings and threats that were part of every day. Vincent took part in this system of violence. He understood it. He accepted it as necessary. But it also shaped him in basic ways. A person who is willing and able to kill another human being is not the same as someone who has never crossed that line. They've learned something about themselves, about their ability to be ruthless, that most people never have to face. The question that would later be argued in courtrooms and in the public mind was whether Vincent was simply a product of his environment, someone who had been raised in a system where violence was normal, or whether there was something in his character that made him particularly suited to this life. The answer is probably some mix of both. Vincent was born into circumstances that led him toward the Mafia, but he also made choices conscious, deliberate choices to take part in and continue that system. After the Katz murder, Vincent continued his rise through the Bonanno family. The killing had proven his loyalty and capability. It had shown that he could be trusted with the organization's darkest secrets. It had shown that he would do whatever was necessary to protect the family. But the murder also created a weakness that Vincent might not have fully understood at the time. The more people who knew about a crime, the more likely it became that someone would eventually talk. The longer a secret was kept, the more likely it became that circumstances would change in ways that would expose it. Vincent had created a time bomb that would take more than 40 years to explode, but when it did, it would threaten to destroy him, for now. Though Vincent was on the way up, he was a made member of the Bonanno family with a growing reputation and increasing responsibilities. He was earning good money from various criminal businesses. He had the respect of his peers and the fear of his enemies. He was living the life he had been born to live. And he was about to become part of the biggest robbery in American history, by the late 1970s. John F. Kennedy International Airport in Queens had become what one police official called a shopping mall for the Mafia. The huge complex, covering more than 5,000 acres and serving as a major international hub, was full of organized crime. Cargo theft was everywhere, with millions of dollars in goods disappearing every year. Labor unions that controlled airport workers were filled with mob members. Security was weak or actively broken into. For criminals like Vincent Asaro, JFK represented endless opportunity. The airport's Lufthansa cargo terminal was particularly attractive to criminals. As the cargo hub for Germany's national airline, it handled enormous amounts of valuable goods, electronics, jewelry, cash, and other high-value items being shipped between Europe and America. More importantly, the security at the terminal was known to be weak, relying mostly on a small number of guards and old alarm systems. For years, various criminals had been stealing smaller loads from the Lufthansa terminal, a few suitcases here, some boxes there. These were profitable crimes, but relatively small. What Vincent and his partners began planning in 1978 was something totally different. A robbery that would target not a few $1,000s, but millions. A robbery so big that it would make headlines around the world and become part of American criminal legend. Every great robbery requires inside information, and the Lufthansa job was no different. The key to the operation was a Lufthansa employee named Louis Werner, who had access to sensitive information about the terminal's operations, security steps, and most importantly, when large amounts of cash would be present. Werner had financial problems, gambling debts that he couldn't pay. This made him open to criminal recruitment. Through a series of go-betweens, Werner was approached and eventually agreed to provide the information necessary to pull off the robbery. He would tell the robbers when a particularly large shipment of cash would be at the terminal, how to get around security systems where guards would be, and how to get in and out of the building quickly. The involvement of Werner shows an important rule of organized crime. Corruption is usually more effective than force. Rather than trying to overcome the terminal security through strength, the criminals simply recruited someone on the inside who could tell them how to avoid that security altogether. This approach, bribing, threatening, or recruiting insiders, was basic to the mafia's success in many criminal businesses. The information Werner provided was incredible. On December 11, 1978, the Lufthansa terminal would be holding about $5 million in US money that had been exchanged by American tourists in Germany. It was being returned to US banks. Additionally, there would be about $875,000 in jewelry and other valuables. All of this would be in a single vault in the cargo terminal, guarded by only a handful of employees. Once the target was identified and the inside information secured, the next step was putting together a crew capable of pulling off such an ambitious robbery. This required a careful balance. The crew needed to be large enough to handle all the necessary tasks, but small enough to keep the operation secret. Too many people meant too many opportunities for someone to talk, but too few people meant the job might fail. The mastermind behind the operation was James "Jimmy the Gent" Burke, the same man who had helped Vincent murder Paul Katz nearly 10 years earlier. Burke was a legendary criminal known for his intelligence, his ability to plan complex operations, and his absolute ruthlessness in dealing with anyone who crossed him. Burke had spent years building relationships with various criminals, building a network of people he could call on for different types of jobs. Vincent Asaro's role in the robbery was important, though the exact nature of his involvement would be argued for decades. According to later testimony and police claims, Vincent helped plan the robbery, provided some of the people, and was expecting to receive a share of the money. His connection to the Bonanno family gave the operation a level of legitimacy and protection other criminals knew that interfering with a Bonanno operation could have deadly results. The crew put together for the job included a mix of experienced criminals and younger guys who were looking to make a name for themselves. Some were professional armed robbers who had pulled off similar, though smaller, jobs. Others were mob associates who provided muscle or special skills. All of them understood the stakes. If they succeeded, they would be rich. If they failed, they would likely spend the rest of their lives in prison or worse. If they were suspected of being potential informants, the planning for the Lufthansa robbery took months. Every detail had to be thought about, every possible problem planned for. How would they get into the terminal? How would they control the employees and guards? How would they open the vault? How would they transport the money and valuables? How would they avoid leaving evidence behind? And most importantly, how would they get away without being caught? The planning meetings took place in various locations around Queens, social clubs, restaurants, private homes. The people involved had to be careful about discussing the job in places where they might be overheard or recorded. This was the time before cell phones and electronic surveillance were everywhere. But the FBI was still actively trying to get inside and watch organized crime operations. One of the key decisions was about violence. Would this be an armed robbery where the robbers burst in with guns firing? Or would it be a more controlled operation where they tried to avoid unnecessary violence? Burke, using his extensive experience, argued for a controlled approach. The robbers would be armed and would use the threat of violence to control the situation, but actual shooting would be avoided if possible. This would reduce the risk of something going wrong. and would make the following police response less intense. Another crucial decision involved getting rid of evidence. The vehicles used in the robbery would need to be stolen in advance and then destroyed afterward. The robbers would wear disguises and gloves to avoid leaving fingerprints or other scientific evidence. Most importantly, the crew would need to keep absolute silence about the operation, both before and after it happened. The logistics of moving several $1 million in cash and valuables also required careful planning. Cash is bulky, and heavy $5 million in small bills weighs hundreds of pounds. The crew would need vehicles capable of carrying the load, and they would need to move quickly before police could set up roadblocks or begin searching the area. As December 11th, 1978 got closer, tension among the crew members reached its highest point. This was it. The job they had been planning for months was about to happen. Some of the people involved later described being unable to sleep in the nights leading up to the robbery, running through the plan over and over in their minds, thinking about everything that could go wrong. For Vincent, this job represented a chance to make more money in a single night than most people earned in years. His share of the money, if the job went as planned, would be big enough to fund his operations for years, enough to increase his status within the Bonanno family, enough to secure his future. But Vincent also understood the risks. Armored car robberies and major heists were among the crimes that police took most seriously. The FBI would put enormous resources into solving such a high-profile crime. Every member of the crew would be looked at closely. Anyone with a criminal record, anyone known to associate with Jimmy Burke or other involved people, anyone who suddenly came into unexplained wealth, all would become suspects. The key to getting away with such a crime wasn't just pulling it off successfully. It was what came after: keeping discipline, keeping silent, not drawing attention to yourself, and above all, not giving police any reason to focus on you specifically. This required patience, self-control, and following the code that had been drilled into Vincent since childhood. On the night of December 10th, 1978, Vincent likely went through his normal routine, trying not to attract attention or act differently than usual. He couldn't afford to seem nervous or worried. In the world of organized crime, any change from normal behavior could attract suspicion from police, from rivals, even from your own partners. As midnight passed and December 11th began, the crew members made their final preparations. Stolen vehicles were put in place, disguises were prepared, weapons were checked, routes were reviewed. And somewhere in that group was Vincent Asaro, about to take part in what would become the most famous robbery in American history. In the early morning hours of December 11th, 1978, while most of New York City slept, a van pulled up to the Lufthansa cargo terminal at JFK Airport. Inside were 6 masked men, armed and ready to carry out the plan they had been practicing for months. The timing had been chosen carefully. 3 a.m. was when the terminal had the fewest employees present, when security was most weak, when the chances of unexpected problems were lowest. The robbers moved quickly and efficiently. Using the information provided by Louis Werner, they knew exactly where to enter, how to get around the first security measures, and where the employees would be. The element of surprise was crucial. By the time anyone realized what was happening, the robbers needed to already be in control of the situation. The first employees met were quickly overpowered. Guns were pointed, threats were made, and cooperation was demanded. This was the most dangerous part of the operation. If even one employee resisted, if someone managed to set off an alarm, if a security guard happened to be in an unexpected location, the entire plan could fall apart. But the inside information proved accurate. The employees were exactly where Werner said they would be. The security measures were exactly as described. The robbers, their faces covered, their voices disguised, quickly took control of the terminal. Once the first entry was secured, The robbers began gathering all the employees and guards into a central location where they could be watched. This was standard procedure for this type of robbery. Put all the potential threats into one controllable group. Use fear and threats to keep them cooperative. And move as quickly as possible to complete the actual theft. The employees were ordered to lie face down on the floor. Their hands were tied. Threats were made about what would happen if anyone tried to be a hero. The robbers wanted absolute control, absolute cooperation, no surprises. Some of the employees later described being terrified, convinced they were going to be killed. Others said the robbers seemed professional and focused, not unnecessarily violent. This professionalism was on purpose. Burke had made clear that unnecessary violence would only create problems. Murdering witnesses would turn a robbery case into a murder case, bringing even more police attention. The goal was to terrify people into cooperation without actually hurting them. Fear was the tool, not actual violence, with the employees secured. The robbers moved to the next phase, getting into the vault. Again, Werner's information proved priceless. The robbers knew the combination, knew the steps, knew exactly what they were looking for. This wasn't a matter of trying to break into an unbreakable safe. It was more like following a recipe, step by step, to get to what was inside. When the vault was opened, what the robbers saw must have been even better than their most hopeful expectations. Stacks of cash neatly bundled and organized. Cases of jewelry and other valuables. Millions of dollars in portable, relatively untraceable wealth. All sitting there waiting to be taken. The robbers immediately began loading the money and valuables into bags and containers they had brought with them. This was harder work than it might sound. Cash is heavy, and moving millions of dollars worth requires significant physical effort. But adrenaline and the promise of wealth drove them forward. They worked in an organized way, making sure to take everything of value, but also watching the clock. Every minute they spent in the terminal was another minute for something to go wrong, for a police patrol to drive by, for an employee to get free and set off an alarm. For some unforeseen problem to come up. Speed was essential. As the bags were filled, they were carried out to the van. The lookout stationed outside reported that everything was clear. No sign of police. No unexpected activity. The operation was going exactly as planned. A Sundas Honda. Precise robbery carried out with military efficiency. After about an hour inside the terminal, the robbers had loaded everything they could carry. The final take would later be estimated at about $5 million in cash and $875,000 in jewelry, roughly $6 million total, equal to more than $30 million in today's money. It was at that moment the largest cash robbery in American history. Before leaving, the robbers gave the tied-up employees final warnings about cooperation. They were told not to call for help for at least 30 minutes, giving the robbers time to get clear of the area. They were told that any attempt to identify the robbers or provide information to police would have consequences. The unspoken threat was clear. We know who you are. We know where to find you. Don't be a hero. Then the robbers were gone, disappearing into the pre-dawn darkness of Queens. The van carrying the enormous haul headed away from JFK, following pre-planned routes designed to avoid traffic cameras and police patrols. Inside the terminal, the tied employees waited the required time before freeing themselves and calling for help. The Lufthansa robbery had been pulled off perfectly, but the most dangerous part was just beginning. When the first police arrived at the Lufthansa terminal, they found a scene of organized chaos. Employees were freed and questioned. The vault was inspected. Security footage was reviewed. And the size of the theft quickly became clear. $6 million was an enormous sum, even by the standards of major robberies. This wasn't some small-time crew stealing a few thousand. This was a professional operation that had pulled off something bold and never done before. The response from police was immediate and huge. The FBI took over the investigation within hours. This was now a federal case involving moving stolen property across state lines, and the Bureau was determined to solve it. Agents began interviewing employees, looking for any detail that might identify the robbers. Informants were contacted. Known partners of various criminal organizations were put under watch. The investigation was made a top priority. For the robbers, now safely away from the airport with their enormous haul, the hard part was just beginning. They had successfully stolen the money. Now they had to figure out how to keep it and keep themselves out of prison. The news of the Lufthansa robbery spread quickly. By the time the morning newspapers hit the streets, the robbery was front-page news. Television news programs led with the story. The size of the theft, the boldness of the operation, the sheer amount stolen, all of it captured the public's imagination. For police, the publicity added pressure to solve the case quickly. The FBI put together a large task force dedicated only to the Lufthansa investigation. Every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every potential lead was followed aggressively. The Bureau was confident that a crime of this size couldn't remain unsolved for long. Surely someone would talk. Someone would make a mistake. Someone would lead them to the people who did it. But they underestimated the discipline of the crew and the effectiveness of the Mafia's code of silence. The robbers had been carefully chosen for their reliability and secrecy. They understood that bragging about the robbery or spending money obviously would bring immediate attention. Most importantly, they knew that Jimmy Burke was watching and that any slip-up could be deadly. For Vincent Asaro, the hours and days after the robbery required careful navigation. He had to act completely normal, show no sign of nervousness or unusual wealth, avoid any behavior that might attract attention from police or from anyone else. This was easier said than done. Sitting on a fortune while knowing that dozens of FBI agents were actively investigating was intensely stressful. The crew met in safe locations to divide the money. This distribution had been planned in advance, with shares given out based on each person's role in the operation. But even this process was dangerous. Every meeting was another opportunity for surveillance. Another chance for someone to be followed or recorded. Within days, the Lufthansa robbery had become a national sensation. The press called it the crime of the century, comparing it to the famous Brinks robbery of 1950. Television news programs did special reports. Magazines ran feature stories. The public was fascinated by the boldness of the crime, and the public was fascinated by the boldness of the crime. Apparent sophistication of the criminals. This media attention was a double-edged sword for the people who did it. On one hand, it showed their success. They had pulled off something truly remarkable that would be remembered for decades. On the other hand, the intense publicity meant that police were under enormous pressure to solve the case, and that net resources would be put into the investigation on a never-before-seen scale. The employees who had been present during the robbery were interviewed repeatedly, asked to describe anything they could remember about the robbers, their voices, their mannerisms, their physical characteristics. But the robbers had been careful. They had worn masks, disguised their voices, left behind minimal physical evidence. The employees could provide general descriptions, but nothing specific enough to identify individual suspects. The inside man, Louis Werner, was quickly identified and arrested. But Werner had been kept separate from the actual robbers. He had provided information through go-betweens and claimed not to know who had actually pulled off the robbery. While Werner would eventually be convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison, his arrest didn't break the case or lead investigators to the other participants. For Vincent and the other robbers, the weeks after the robbery were spent trying to maintain normal life while sitting on enormous wealth. The money couldn't be spent freely. Suddenly buying expensive cars or houses would immediately attract suspicion. Instead, it had to be carefully laundered, gradually mixed into real businesses, used in ways that wouldn't create obvious trails back to the robbery. This required patience and discipline that not all the crew members had. Some began spending their shares too freely, buying gifts for girlfriends, gambling more heavily, living beyond their previously known means. Each of these expenses was a potential clue for investigators, a thread that could be pulled to unravel the entire plan. Jimmy Burke, paranoid and ruthless, began to worry about loose ends. He had seen too many criminals get caught because someone in the crew couldn't keep their mouth shut or couldn't resist bragging about what they had done. And Burke had a simple, brutal solution to the problem of loose ends: eliminate them. What followed the Lufthansa robbery was almost as famous as the robbery itself. A wave of murders that would eventually claim the lives of many people connected to the robbery. And Vincent Asaro, the man who had helped murder Paul Katz years earlier, was about to see violence on a scale that would horrify even hardened criminals. In the months following the Lufthansa robbery, a disturbing pattern appeared. People connected to the robbery began disappearing or turning up dead. What had seemed like the perfect crime was becoming a bloodbath as Jimmy Burke systematically eliminated anyone he viewed as a potential threat to the operation's secrecy. The first victim was Martin Krugman, a bookmaker who had first connected Louis Werner with the robbery crew. Krugman disappeared in early January 1979, just weeks after the robbery. His body was never found, but police and criminals alike knew what had happened. Burke had decided that Krugman knew too much and couldn't be trusted to keep quiet. Krugman's murder was meant to send a message to the other crew members: stay silent or suffer the same fate. The murders continued throughout 1979 and into 1980. Stax Edwards, a career criminal who had taken part in the robbery, was found shot to death in his apartment. Louis Cafora and his wife Joanna were found murdered in their car, left in a parking lot as a horrible warning. Tommy DeSimone, another participant, disappeared and was never seen again, likely killed, not just for his involvement in Lufthansa, but for other mistakes within the Mafia. Burke's killing spree was driven by a toxic mix of greed and paranoia. Each person eliminated meant one less person to share the money with, and one less person who could potentially work with police. But it was also driven by Burke's deep-seated belief that most criminals were basically unreliable, that given enough pressure from police, most people would eventually talk. This paranoia wasn't completely wrong. The FBI was indeed putting enormous pressure on anyone connected to the robbery. Known partners were being followed. Phones were being tapped. Bank records were being subpoenaed. The Bureau was offering deals, reduced sentences, witness protection, money to anyone willing to provide information about the robbery. For Vincent Asaro and the other survivors, watching friends and partners disappear or turn up dead created its own psychological pressure. How could you trust anyone when the person you worked with last week might be dead this week? How could you be sure you weren't on Burke's list? How did you show loyalty while also protecting yourself from a man who saw potential threats everywhere? The answer was to keep absolute discipline. Don't talk about the robbery with anyone, even other participants. Don't spend money in ways that attract attention. Don't do anything that might make Burke suspicious. And above all, don't give police any reason to focus on you specifically. That Vincent survived this period when so many others didn't speaks to several factors. First, he had the protection of the Bonanno family. Burke, though powerful and feared, couldn't simply murder a made member of one of the 5 families without consequences. There were rules, steps, protocols that had to be followed. Killing Vincent would have required approval from Bonanno family leadership, and such approval would only be given if there was clear evidence of betrayal. Second, Vincent showed exactly the kind of secrecy and discipline that Burke valued. He didn't brag about the robbery. He didn't spend money, obviously. He didn't give police any reason to connect him to the robbery. In Burke's eyes, This made Vincent trustworthy, or at least less dangerous than the others who were being eliminated. Third, Vincent likely had his own power. His connections within the Bonanno family, his own crew and partners, his reputation as someone who could be counted on, all of these factors made him dangerous to kill and valuable to keep alive. In the Mafia's world, survival often depended on being more useful alive than dead. But Vincent also had to live with the knowledge of what had happened to the others. Some of these people had been friends, partners he had worked with for years. Now they were gone, murdered on Burke's orders. Their bodies gotten rid of in various brutal and efficient ways. And Vincent had to act as if this was normal, as if this was simply the cost of doing business in their world. As the bodies piled up, police became even more determined to solve the Lufthansa case. The FBI knew that the murders were connected to the robbery, that Burke was eliminating potential witnesses. But knowing and proving were two different things. Without witnesses willing to testify, without physical evidence connecting specific individuals to specific crimes, prosecutors couldn't bring charges. The investigation began focusing on Jimmy Burke himself. Agents followed him constantly, writing down his movements, his partners, his businesses. They tapped his phones, put listening devices in places he went to, interviewed anyone who had contact with him. The pressure was intense, designed to make Burke paranoid and prone to mistakes. But Burke was a careful criminal, trained in the ways of avoiding police. He had sensitive conversations while walking in parks or driving in cars places where electronic surveillance was difficult. He communicated through go-betweens, keeping plausible deniability about his involvement in various crimes. He presented himself as a real businessman, running a bar and other legal businesses, with no obvious source of illegal income. Vincent faced similar close examination. FBI agents interviewed his neighbors, his business partners, anyone who knew him. They pulled his financial records, looking for unexplained deposits or purchases. They watched his movements, hoping to catch him meeting with other suspects or doing something that would provide evidence of criminal activity. But Vincent, like Burke, was experienced in avoiding police attention. He kept a low profile, conducted business carefully, and most importantly, never discussed the robbery with anyone who might be wearing a wire or who might later testify against him. As years passed and the first wave of murders slowed, the Lufthansa robbery began to take on almost legendary proportions in the public imagination. It was the crime that had been pulled off perfectly, but whose perpetrators had mostly gotten away with it. The FBI knew who many of the participants were, but couldn't prove it in court. The money, except for small amounts recovered early on, was never found, presumably laundered, hidden, or spent in ways that couldn't be traced. Books were written about the robbery, each trying to piece together what had actually happened and who had been involved. Journalists interviewed retired police officers, former criminals, anyone who might have insight into the crime. The robbery became part of American criminal folklore, referenced in television shows and movies, discussed in true crime podcasts decades later. For Vincent, the robbery was both his greatest success and his greatest weakness. If he had indeed taken part and profited from it, he had pulled off something remarkable and gotten away with it. But he also had to live knowing that police had never stopped investigating, that the case file remained open, that new evidence or testimony could come out at any time. The irony was that the code of silence that had protected Vincent and the other survivors was also what made the crime so famous. If someone had talked, if the case had been solved quickly, the Lufthansa robbery would have been just another robbery. But because it remained unsolved, because the perpetrators seemingly got away with it, the robbery became legendary, which meant that police never stopped trying to break the case. In 1982, Jimmy Burke was finally convicted, but not for Lufthansa or for any of the murders that followed it. Instead, he was convicted of fixing college basketball games, a crime that carried a 12-year sentence. Then, in 1985, he was convicted of the murder of Richard Eaton, A drug dealer Burke had killed in 1979 and received a life sentence. Burke would spend the rest of his life in prison, never officially charged with the Lufthansa robbery despite police certainty about his involvement. He died in prison in 1996, taking whatever he knew about the robbery and its aftermath to his grave. His death marked the end of an era, the passing of one of the last of the old-school criminal masterminds who had operated in New York during the 1970s and 1980s. For Vincent, Burke's imprisonment and eventual death removed both a threat and a protection. On one hand, Vincent no longer had to worry about Burke deciding he was a problem. On the other hand, he lost the protection that came from being associated with such a feared figure. Vincent would have to navigate the criminal underworld on his own merits, his own reputation, his own careful management of relationships and threats. The Lufthansa robbery, despite all the deaths and all the police attention, remained officially unsolved. The money was never recovered. Most of the participants were never charged. And Vincent Asaro continued his life as a mobster, building his career in the Bonanno family, earning a reputation as someone who could be trusted with the organization's secrets. But the robbery cast a long shadow over everything that followed. It was always there in the background, a potential source of exposure and prosecution. And decades later, it would finally come back to haunt Vincent in ways he could never have expected. On September 19, 1990, Martin Scorsese's film Goodfellas opened in theaters across America. Based on Nicholas Pileggi's book Wise Guy, which told the true story of Henry Hill, a mobster turned government witness, the film showed life in the mafia with never-before-seen realism and detail. And at the center of the film's plot was the Lufthansa robbery renamed, but clearly recognizable for Vincent Asaro and other real criminals who had been part of that world. Watching Goodfellas must have been a strange experience. Here was their life, their world, their crime shown on screen for mass entertainment. The social clubs they went to, the scams they ran, the violence they committed, all of it was shown with an accuracy that could only have come from someone who had actually lived that life. The character of Jimmy Conway, played by Robert De Niro, was clearly based on Jimmy Burke. The film showed Conway's role in planning and carrying out the Lufthansa robbery, called the Air France robbery in the film to avoid legal issues. And it showed his later paranoia and murder spree as he eliminated potential witnesses. For anyone who knew the real story, the parallels were obvious and chilling. Goodfellas became a cultural phenomenon, eventually considered one of the greatest films ever made. It changed how Americans thought about the mafia, moving away from the romanticized showing of The Godfather towards something darker, more realistic, more morally unclear. The film showed that mobsters weren't noble men bound by honor. They were criminals who lied, stole, murdered, and betrayed each other with casual frequency. The film's showing of the Lufthansa robbery brought renewed public attention to the real crime. Newspapers ran looking back articles about the robbery. Television news programs did special reports. A new generation of Americans learned about one of the boldest robberies in the nation's history. And the public's fascination with the unsolved mystery only grew stronger. For police, the film's popularity was both helpful and frustrating. On one hand, the renewed public interest put pressure on the FBI to finally solve the case. On the other hand, the film's showing, while broadly accurate, also contained made-up elements that confused the public understanding of what had actually happened. Separating fact from fiction became more difficult as the movie's version of events became stuck in popular culture. For Vincent, the existence of Goodfellas created a strange new reality. He was watching his own life, his own crimes, shown on screen, but his name was never mentioned. The character of Jimmy Conway was clearly Burke, and if you knew the real story, you could identify various other characters as being based on real people. But Vincent himself was absent from the film. protected by his following of omerta and by the fact that Henry Hill, the government witness whose testimony formed the basis of the film, didn't know all the details of who had been involved. This anonymity was both protection and frustration. On one hand, Vincent wasn't publicly associated with the robbery, which made it harder for police to build a case against him. On the other hand, he had allegedly pulled off one of the greatest robberies in American history, and he couldn't claim credit for it. He had to watch as Burke got all the attention, all the fame, while Vincent remained unknown except to the small circle of people who knew the truth. Friends and partners who saw the film sometimes asked Vincent about it, curious about how accurate the showing was, what it was like to live that life. Vincent's responses were always careful, guarded. He might admit that the film captured certain parts of mob life accurately, but he never admitted to specific crimes or specific involvement in anything illegal, even in private conversations, even with people he trusted. Vincent kept the discipline that had kept him out of prison for decades. Goodfellas had an unexpected result. It inspired a new generation's fascination with organized crime. Young people who watched the film saw the lifestyle, the money, the respect, the excitement, and some of them were attracted to it despite, or perhaps because of, the violence and criminality it showed. This created both opportunities and challenges for actual mobsters like Vincent. On one hand, there were young recruits who wanted to join the life, who saw the mafia as exciting and important. On the other hand, these recruits often had unrealistic expectations shaped by movies rather than reality. They didn't understand the discipline required, the constant danger, the fact that most mobsters ended up dead or in prison. They saw the glamour, but not the reality. Vincent, now in his 50s and a respected capo regime in the Bonanno family, found himself in a teaching role trying to educate younger members about how the life really worked. The rules, the protocols, the need for secrecy and discipline, all of these had to be taught to people who had learned about the mafia primarily through films and television. But Vincent also recognized that the world was changing. The old certainties, the old ways of doing business were being challenged by new realities. Police was becoming more sophisticated. The RICO law was allowing prosecutors to target entire organizations rather than just individual criminals. And most troubling of all, the code of omerta was beginning to break down as more and more mobsters chose to work with authorities rather than face long prison sentences, despite Goodfellas and despite decades of police investigation. The Lufthansa robbery remained officially unsolved. The FBI had theories, suspicions, even certainty about who had been involved. But suspicion wasn't proof, and without testimony from participants or physical evidence connecting specific individuals to the crime, prosecutors couldn't bring charges. The money, except for relatively small amounts, recovered shortly after the robbery, was never found. Had it been spent? Laundered through real businesses? Hidden in offshore accounts? Distributed among so many people that it became impossible to trace? The mystery only added to the robbery's legend. For Vincent, the continued unsolved status of the case was both a source of pride and a constant worry. If he had indeed taken part in and profited from the robbery, he had gotten away with something that had escaped police for decades. But he also knew that there was no time limit on major federal crimes, that the case file remained open, that new evidence or testimony could come out at any time, every time the robbery was mentioned in the news, every time a new article or book or documentary appeared. Vincent had to wonder whether this would be the time when someone connected the dots, when new evidence came to light, when the anonymous survivor was finally identified and charged. But year after year, decade after decade, the case remained unsolved. The main people were dead or in prison for other crimes. The witnesses were dead or had faded into obscurity. And Vincent Asaro continued his life in the shadows, a ghost in his own legend. The man who had been part of history, but whose name appeared in no history books, The world had changed dramatically since that December night in 1978. The Cold War had ended. Personal computers had become common. The internet was changing communication and business. But the Lufthansa robbery remained frozen in time, an unsolved mystery from another era. A reminder that sometimes the criminals really do get away with it. For Vincent, the 1990s represented a kind of golden age. He had survived when so many others had fallen. He had avoided prosecution for major crimes. He had risen to a position of authority within the Bonanno family. He was earning good money from various criminal businesses. And most importantly, he had stayed true to the code that defined his life. He had never worked with police, never betrayed the organization, never broken omerta. But the new century would bring new challenges, new threats, and ultimately a betrayal that would come from the place Vincent least expected. His own family. By the 1980s, Vincent Asaro had firmly established himself as an important figure within the Bonanno crime family. He had earned the rank of caporegime, or captain, putting him in command of his own crew of soldiers and partners. This position came with both power and responsibility. Vincent was now responsible not just for his own criminal activities, but for managing and protecting the members of his crew. Captain in the Mafia was like a middle manager in a real corporation, except the stakes were much higher. Vincent had to make money for the family through various criminal businesses. He had to keep discipline within his crew, settling fights and punishing those who broke the rules. He had to manage relationships with other crews, making sure that territorial boundaries were respected and that conflicts didn't turn into violence. And he had to protect his crew from police, keeping the operational security that kept everyone out of prison. Vincent's crew operated primarily out of Queens, the same neighborhoods where he had grown up. This gave him certain advantages. He knew the territory intimately, had relationships with local business owners, and could rely on a network of family and childhood friends. But it also meant he was operating in an area that police knew to watch, where FBI agents had informants and surveillance operations. Vincent's criminal activities during this time showed a mix of traditional mafia businesses and adaptation to new opportunities. Loan sharking remained a core business, lending money at extremely high interest rates to people who couldn't borrow from real sources. This required money to lend out, but it also provided steady income as borrowers made their weekly or monthly payments. Those who couldn't or wouldn't pay faced escalating consequences, from threats to violence to being forced to turn over assets or take part in other criminal activities to work off their debts. Gambling operations were another major source of income. Vincent's crew ran bookmaking operations, taking bets on sporting events and other competitions. They also ran illegal card games and dice games, taking a percentage of every pot. These operations required careful management, enough action to be profitable, but not so much visibility that police would prioritize shutting them down. Extortion, while less profitable than in the past, still provided steady income. Business owners in Vincent's territory paid regular tribute for protection that was actually protection from Vincent and his crew. The amounts were calculated to be affordable but meaningful, taking advantage of the business without destroying it. Labor racketeering provided opportunities to profit from real businesses. By controlling certain unions or having influence with union officials, Vincent's crew could demand payouts from contractors, steal from pension funds, or create no-show jobs that provided income without requiring actual work. But even as Vincent did well, the world around him was changing in ways that threatened the traditional mafia model. The RICO Act, passed in 1970 but increasingly used by prosecutors in the 1980s and beyond, allowed police to target entire criminal organizations rather than just individual criminals. Under RICO, prosecutors could show a pattern of criminal activity and charge everyone involved in the enterprise, even if they hadn't personally committed specific crimes. This was devastating to organized crime. Previously, bosses and top leaders could protect themselves from prosecution by having underlings carry out actual crimes. Under RICO, the boss's role in directing the organization could itself be prosecuted. The law treated the mafia as a continuing criminal enterprise, and membership in that enterprise could itself be a crime. Electronic surveillance was becoming more sophisticated and more common. The FBI was planting bugs in social clubs, restaurants, and even private homes. Phone taps were providing prosecutors with recordings of incriminating conversations. Wearing a wire carrying a hidden recording device was becoming standard practice for cooperating witnesses, allowing police to gather evidence even from private conversations. But perhaps the most important change was cultural. The code of omerta, which had been nearly absolute for generations, was beginning to crack. More and more mobsters were choosing to work with authorities, becoming government witnesses in exchange for reduced sentences or entry into the witness protection program. The breakdown of omerta represented an existential threat to the mafia. The organization's power had always rested on its impenetrability. Police could suspect, could even know, but couldn't prove without testimony from insiders. Once insiders started testifying, the entire structure became vulnerable. Several factors contributed to this erosion. First, sentences were getting longer. The mandatory minimum sentences introduced in the 1980s and 1990s meant that conviction for drug crimes or other major offenses could result in decades in prison. Faced with spending the rest of their life behind bars, many criminals chose to work with police instead. Second, the witness protection program provided a way out. Cooperating witnesses and their families could be relocated, given new identities, and protected from payback. While life in witness protection was often difficult and isolating, it beat being dead or spending life in prison. Third, the younger generation didn't have the same commitment to the old code. Many of them had gotten into the life for money and status, not out of any deep cultural tradition or family duty. When faced with serious prison time, they didn't see cooperation as betrayal. They saw it as a rational business decision. For Vincent, watching the code break down was deeply troubling. He had built his entire life and career on the principle of omerta. He had stayed silent through arrests, investigations, and intense police pressure. He had watched friends go to prison rather than testify. The code wasn't just a rule. It was a fundamental part of his identity, his sense of honor and loyalty. But he was also practical enough to recognize the new reality. The organization had to adapt, had to become more careful about what was said in front of whom, had to treat every conversation as potentially recorded, had to assume that anyone facing serious charges might flip and become a cooperator. Despite these challenges, Vincent did well during this period. He built a reputation as one of the old-school mobsters, someone who lived by the traditional code, someone who could be trusted with the organization's secrets. This reputation was valuable in a world where betrayal was becoming more common. Being known as reliably silent was a significant asset. Vincent's temperament helped him in this environment. He was not flashy or showy. He didn't seek attention or publicity. He lived relatively modestly, at least compared to some mobsters who showed off their wealth. He was disciplined about what he said and to whom he said it. And he had a talent for managing relationships, knowing when to be friendly and when to be firm, when to show mercy and when to show strength. His crew was loyal, well-managed, and profitable. Vincent took care of his people, making sure they earned, protecting them when they got into trouble, keeping the kind of fatherly relationship that had traditionally bound mafia crews together. In return, his crew members were reliable, discreet, and willing to do what needed to be done. Vincent also kept good relationships with other crews and other families. He understood that cooperation was often more profitable than conflict, that territorial fights could be talked out rather than fought over, that a reputation for reasonableness was more valuable than a reputation for violence. This didn't mean he was weak. Those who crossed him or showed disrespect learned otherwise. But it meant he was smart about when and how violence was used. Throughout this period, Vincent kept a double life that was common among mobsters. He had a family, a wife, children, the normal signs of home life. To his neighbors and to people outside the criminal world, he appeared to be a normal working-class guy, maybe involved in some kind of small business. Nothing remarkable or suspicious, but this normalcy was a front. Vincent's real life, his real identity, was as a mobster. His closest relationships were with other criminals. His real work was managing criminal businesses. His real duties were to the Bonanno family, not to his actual family. This created inevitable tensions. How could he explain to his wife where the money came from? How could he explain his frequent absences, his secret meetings, his association with known criminals? How could he shield his children from the reality of what he did for a living? Many mobsters handled this by compartmentalizing, keeping their criminal life and their family life as separate as possible. Some were more successful at this than others. Vincent appears to have been relatively successful, keeping a family life that was, if not entirely normal, at least stable and apparently loving. But this compartmentalization had costs. It meant lying to the people closest to you. It meant being unable to share the stresses and dangers of your real life. It meant knowing that your criminal activities could someday impact your family through your arrest, through payback by enemies, through the general instability that came with living. Outside the law, the Bonanno family itself went through significant turmoil during the 1980s and 1990s. Internal power struggles led to violence between different groups. The family's involvement in the drug trade, which had been controversial within the organization, led to increased police attention and many arrests. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, FBI agent Joseph Pistone had gotten inside the Bonanno family under the alias Donnie Brasco, providing prosecutors with never-before-seen insight into the family's operations. When Pistone's true identity was revealed, several Bonanno members who had vouched for him were killed, and the entire family was left reeling from the betrayal. This infiltration had deep effects on mafia culture. The traditional methods of checking new members' family connections, long-term relationships, personal recommendations had proven insufficient. If the FBI could plant an agent who lasted 6 years inside the organization, who became trusted and respected, then how could anyone be sure that the new guy wasn't another undercover agent? Vincent navigated this tumultuous period by being even more cautious. He limited his crew to people he had known for years, people with proven track records and family connections. He avoided taking unnecessary risks. He kept strict operational security, assuming that police was always watching and listening. As the decades passed, Vincent became increasingly seen as a representative of the old school mafia, someone who still lived by the traditional code in an era when that code was becoming outdated. Younger mobsters sometimes saw him as old-fashioned, overly cautious, too committed to rules that no longer made sense in the modern world. But Vincent's approach proved effective. While flashier, more aggressive mobsters attracted police attention and often ended up in prison or dead, Vincent kept a lower profile and avoided major legal troubles. His caution, his discipline, his following of the old code, these weren't just principles. They were survival strategies that had proven effective over decades. Vincent also served as a kind of living link to the mafia's past. He had known and worked with men who had been active since the 1950s and 1960s. He could tell stories about the old days, about how things used to be done, about the legends and characters who had shaped the organization. This institutional memory was valuable, providing younger members with a sense of history and tradition. Vincent also recognized that pure nostalgia was dangerous. The world had changed, and the mafia had to change with it or die. While keeping core principles, loyalty, silence, Respect the organization also had to adapt to new criminal opportunities, new police tactics, and new social realities. As Vincent entered his 60s and then his 70s, he might have expected to gradually step back from active criminal life. In real businesses, retirement is normal and expected. But in the mafia, there was no real retirement. You could become less active, could hand off day-to-day responsibilities to younger members, but you never fully left the life. During this time, Vincent continued to earn from his various businesses, but he also took on more of a mentoring role, teaching younger members how things should be done, settling fights, providing advice based on his decades of experience. He was respected as a senior member of the organization, someone whose opinion carried weight in family decisions. But respect didn't mean safety. The life that had served Vincent well for so many years was becoming increasingly dangerous. Police had become extremely sophisticated, using electronic surveillance, financial analysis, and cooperating witnesses to build cases that were almost impossible to defend against. The RICO law allowed prosecutors to charge people with conspiracy, even if they hadn't personally committed specific crimes. More and more of Vincent's contemporaries were being arrested, convicted, and sentenced to long prison terms. The Bonanno family, like all the 5 families, was under constant pressure from police. Every social club could have listening devices. Every phone conversation could be monitored. Every partner could potentially be wearing a wire. Vincent had survived this long by being careful, disciplined, and loyal to the code. But the question was whether those qualities would be enough as police continued to tighten the noose around organized crime. And the answer would come from the most painful source imaginable: a betrayal by his own flesh and blood. In the world of organized crime, there are many forms of betrayal. Business partners can cheat each other. Friends can become enemies. Partners can become informants. But there is one betrayal that is considered worse than all others. A betrayal by family, not mafia family, but actual blood family. A father betrayed by his son. A man betrayed by his own flesh and blood. For Vincent Asaro, this unthinkable betrayal became reality when his son, Jerome Asaro, began working with the FBI. Jerome had followed his father into the life, becoming involved with the Bonanno family and taking part in various criminal activities. For Vincent, this must have been both a source of pride and concern. Pride that his son was carrying on the family tradition. Concern about the dangers inherent in that life. But Vincent had raised Jerome in the code, had taught him the importance of loyalty and silence, had shown through his own life how a man was supposed to conduct himself. What Vincent apparently didn't fully understand was how much the world had changed, how much the old certainties no longer held, how the calculations that had made sense in his youth no longer applied in the 21st century. By the late 2000s, the FBI had been investigating Vincent for decades. They knew about his alleged involvement in the Lufthansa robbery. They suspected him of multiple murders. They had evidence of his role in various criminal businesses. But suspicion and evidence weren't enough. They needed testimony from someone who had direct knowledge of Vincent's crimes. Someone who could provide the detailed, specific information that would convince a jury. Jerome Asaro became their target. The exact details of how the FBI flipped Jerome remain unclear. These processes always involve a mix of pressure and incentive, threats and promises. Jerome was facing his own legal troubles, and the FBI likely made clear that cooperation could lead to leniency, while refusal could lead to decades in prison. For Jerome, the decision to cooperate meant weighing his loyalty to his father and the code. He had been raised with against a very real possibility of spending most of his remaining life in prison. The old code demanded silence, demanded that he accept whatever punishment came rather than betray the organization and his father. But the new reality was that many people in Jerome's position chose cooperation, that the code was more ignored than followed. That survival and self-preservation were rational responses to an impossible situation. Jerome chose to cooperate. As if the betrayal by his son wasn't enough, Vincent also faced cooperation from Gaspar Valenti, his cousin. Valenti had been involved in various criminal activities with Vincent over the years, and he too decided that cooperation with police was better than the alternative. Valenti's decision to flip was driven by similar calculations, as Jerome's facing significant prison time, offered deals by prosecutors, and living in a world where cooperation had become more common and less looked down upon than in previous generations. But for Vincent, the betrayal by a cousin, by someone he had grown up with and trusted for decades, was another devastating blow. Between Jerome and Valenti, the FBI now had witnesses who could provide detailed testimony about Vincent's criminal activities spanning decades. They could testify about specific crimes, specific conversations, specific instances of criminal conduct. They could back up each other's testimony, making it harder for defense lawyers to discredit them. And most importantly, they could testify about the Lufthansa robbery and the murder of Paul Katz, crimes that had remained unsolved for decades. With cooperating witnesses in hand, the FBI launched an intensive investigation of Vincent. They got court orders for electronic surveillance, planting listening devices in places where Vincent conducted business and monitoring his phone conversations. They followed him, writing down his movements and his associations. They subpoenaed financial records, looking for evidence of unexplained income or suspicious transactions. The investigation showed a man still actively involved in organized crime despite being in his 70s. Vincent was still running his crew, still earning from various criminal businesses, still involved in the day-to-day management of Bonanno family operations. He hadn't slowed down or retired. He was still living the life he had chosen more than half a century earlier. The recorded conversations captured Vincent discussing various crimes and criminal activities. While he was careful never to explicitly admit to specific illegal acts, the context and content of the conversations provided prosecutors with evidence of his ongoing involvement in organized crime. Combined with the testimony from Jerome and Valenti, the FBI believed they finally had enough to bring charges against Vincent for crimes that had gone unpunished for decades. For Vincent, learning that his own son had become an FBI informant must have been devastating. This wasn't just a betrayal by a partner or even a close friend. This was a betrayal by his own child, someone he had raised and loved, someone he had tried to teach the code that had governed his own life. The father-son relationship in Mafia families is complex and difficult. Fathers often want their sons to avoid the life, to have real careers and normal lives free from the constant danger and legal trouble that comes with being a mobster. But at the same time, there's often pride when sons follow in their father's footsteps, carrying on the family tradition. Vincent had apparently accepted Jerome's involvement in the life, had worked with him, had trusted him with sensitive information and responsibilities. Now that trust had been betrayed in the most basic way possible. Jerome had chosen his own freedom over his father's, had broken the most basic principle of omerta, had done something that would have been literally unthinkable in earlier generations of the Mafia. The psychological impact of this betrayal is hard to overstate. Vincent had survived decades in a dangerous, paranoid world by trusting his instincts about people, by carefully managing relationships, by following the code that made trust possible within the organization. But how do you keep that worldview when your own son betrays you? How do you continue to believe in loyalty and honor when the person who should have been most loyal, most honorable, proves to be neither? As the FBI investigation continued through 2009, 2010, 2011, and into 2012, the evidence against Vincent piled up. The cooperating witnesses provided detailed testimony. The surveillance recordings captured incriminating conversations. The financial analysis showed unexplained income. And most importantly, in 2013, investigators found the remains of Paul Katz, a man Vincent had allegedly helped murder more than 40 years earlier. The discovery of Katz's remains was a breakthrough for investigators. For years, they had suspected that Katz had been murdered and had general information about where the body might be buried. But without a body, without physical evidence, murder charges were difficult to bring. Now they had remains that could be scientifically analyzed, that could be definitively identified as Katz. That proved he had been murdered and gotten rid of exactly as the cooperating witnesses had described. For Vincent, the discovery of Katz's body must have been chilling. A crime he had committed more than 40 years earlier, a secret he thought would remain buried forever, had literally been dug up. The body that he and others had buried in 1969, in a world before personal computers and cell phones and DNA analysis, was now physical evidence in a modern criminal investigation, using techniques that hadn't existed when the murder was committed. The question was no longer whether Vincent would be arrested. It was when and for what charges. By 2013, Vincent surely knew that arrest was coming. Too much activity, too much investigation, too many cooperating witnesses. The question was how he would handle it. Would he keep the code of silence, refusing to cooperate no matter what charges he faced? Or would he, like so many others, make the calculation that cooperation was better than dying in prison? For Vincent, this wasn't really a question. He had spent his entire life living by the code of omerta. He had kept silence through previous arrests and investigations. He had watched others cooperate and had presumably judged them harshly for their weakness. He had built his reputation, his identity, his sense of self around being someone who could be trusted, who would never rat, who would stand up rather than fold. To cooperate now at age 78, after a lifetime of silence, would be to admit that everything he had stood for was meaningless. It would be to become the very thing he despised. It would be to betray not just the organization, but himself, his own sense of honor and identity. So Vincent prepared to do what he had always done: stay silent, face the charges, and let the system do its worst. He would be a stand-up guy to the end, even if that end came in a federal prison. Better to die with honor than to live as a rat. The code demanded nothing less. January 23, 2014, began like any other winter morning in Queens. The sun rose slowly over the quiet residential streets, casting long shadows across the snow-dusted sidewalks. For most residents, it was just another day going to work, taking kids to school, living the normal rhythms of everyday life. But for Vincent Asaro, this Thursday morning would mark the beginning of the end of his life as a free man. At about 6 a.m., FBI agents surrounded Vincent's home. This was a calculated time for an arrest, early enough that the suspect would likely be home and possibly still asleep, reducing the chance of running away or fighting back, but late enough that neighbors would be awake to witness federal agents coming to the residence. The knock on the door was loud and official. When Vincent answered, he found himself facing a small army of federal agents, armed and wearing bulletproof vests with FBI written across them. They had an arrest warrant, and they were there to take him into custody. At 78 years old, Vincent was no threat to these young, fit federal agents. But procedure was procedure. Suspects in organized crime cases were always treated as potentially dangerous, always approached with overwhelming force. Vincent was handcuffed, read his rights, and told of the charges against him. The charges against Vincent read like a greatest hits of his criminal career. The charges included racketeering, taking part in a criminal enterprise, the Bonanno crime family that engaged in various illegal activities over multiple decades, murder, the 1969 killing of Paul Katz. After 44 years, prosecutors were finally bringing charges for this long-buried crime. using the testimony of cooperating witnesses and the physical remains that had been discovered. Robbery, the Lufthansa robbery. After 35 years of investigation, prosecutors were charging Vincent with taking part in the most famous unsolved robbery in American history. Additional charges included extortion, obstruction of justice, and other crimes that together painted a picture of a man who had spent his entire adult life engaged in criminal activity. Each charge carried significant potential prison time. At Vincent's age, even a moderate sentence would likely be a life sentence. The message from prosecutors was clear. Vincent Asaro was going to die in prison. Within hours of Vincent's arrest, the story was everywhere. Real-life Goodfella mobster arrested screamed the headlines. News organizations led with the story of the arrest, emphasizing Vincent's alleged involvement in the Lufthansa robbery and the bizarre fact that the murder charge involved a crime committed more than 4 decades earlier. The arrest made international news. The Lufthansa robbery had been famous for decades, kept alive in public consciousness by the film Goodfellas and countless true crime books and documentaries. Now finally, someone was being charged with the crime. The fact that the defendant was a 78-year-old man only added to the story's appeal. Here was an actual link to that bygone era. A real person who had allegedly taken part in history. Television news programs ran background segments explaining the Lufthansa robbery, showing clips from Goodfellas, interviewing retired FBI agents and criminal justice experts about the case. True crime enthusiasts followed every development on social media and online forums. The arrest became a cultural moment, connecting the past and present, myth and reality. For the FBI, the arrest was proof of decades of investigation. Agents who had worked on the Lufthansa case had retired without seeing it solved. Now finally, there was an arrest and upcoming trial. The Bureau held a press conference with officials describing the charges and praising the agents who had built the case for the Bonanno family and the broader mafia world. The arrest was another sign of how thoroughly police had gotten inside organized crime. That Vincent could be arrested for crimes committed decades ago, based on testimony from his own son and cousin, showed that no one was safe, that the old code was truly dead, that Omerta could no longer protect even the most disciplined and loyal members. Later that day, Vincent was brought to federal court in Brooklyn for his arraignment. Dressed in normal clothes, but shackled and surrounded by federal marshals, he appeared before a magistrate judge to hear the formal charges against him and enter a plea. Vincent's attorney, a veteran criminal defense lawyer experienced in organized crime, cases stood beside him. The courtroom was packed with journalists, police officials, and members of the public who had managed to get seats. Everyone wanted to witness this moment, the arrest of a real Goodfella for crimes that had become legendary. When asked how he pleaded to the charges, Vincent's response was without hesitation: "Not guilty." This plea was expected. Defendants almost always plead not guilty at arraignment, keeping the right to challenge the evidence and negotiate with prosecutors. But for those who knew Vincent and his history, the plea also represented something more: a refusal to admit guilt, a continued following of the code of silence, a determination to fight the charges rather than accept a plea deal that might require cooperation. The government argued that Vincent was a flight risk and a danger to the community, requesting that he be held without bail. The defense countered that Vincent was 78 years old, in poor health, and had deep roots in the community. He wasn't going anywhere, and at his age and in his condition, he posed no threat to anyone. After hearing arguments from both sides, the judge ordered Vincent held without bail pending trial. He would spend the months leading up to trial in federal detention, preparing his defense while confined to a cell. For a man who had spent 78 years as a free person, who had never served a significant prison sentence despite decades of criminal activity, this pre-trial detention must have been a shocking and depressing experience. In the weeks and months following his arrest, Vincent and his legal team began preparing for trial. This was an enormously complex case involving crimes spanning multiple decades, multiple cooperating witnesses, thousands of pages of documents, and recorded conversations that would need to be reviewed and analyzed. The defense strategy would have to address several key challenges. First, the cooperating witnesses Jerome Asaro and Gaspar Valenti. These were people who had known Vincent intimately, who had taken part in crimes with him, who could provide detailed, specific testimony about his criminal activities. The defense would need to attack their credibility, emphasizing that they were confessed criminals who had made deals with prosecutors in exchange for their testimony. But this was always a difficult strategy. Yes, cooperating witnesses were criminals, but that's precisely why they had knowledge of crimes committed by other criminals. Second, the recorded conversations. While Vincent had been careful never to explicitly admit to specific crimes on tape, the context and content of his conversations could be damaging. The defense would need to argue about interpretation, context, and whether the recordings actually proved criminal activity or just tough talk from an old man. Third, the physical evidence, specifically the remains of Paul Katz. The defense would need to challenge the identification of the remains, the testimony about how they got there, and whether prosecutors could prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Vincent had taken part in the murder more than 40 years earlier. Fourth, the Lufthansa robbery. This charge was particularly problematic because it had become so famous. Every potential juror would have heard of the robbery. Many would have seen Goodfellas, and there would be significant public interest in seeing someone finally convicted for the crime. The defense would need to show that despite all the publicity and investigation, the actual evidence connecting Vincent to the robbery was thin. Vincent's time in pre-trial detention was difficult. Federal detention facilities are not pleasant places. They're designed for security, not comfort. Inmates are locked in cells for much of the day, have limited access to recreation and visitors, and live in a highly controlled, strictly scheduled environment. For Vincent, used to being in control, being a person of respect and authority, the experience of being just another prisoner was degrading. He had no power here, no crew to command, no ability to control his environment or his schedule. He was at the mercy of correctional officers, many of them young enough to be his grandchildren, who treated him like any other inmate. His health, already declining due to age, likely worsened during this period. The stress of facing life in prison, combined with the poor nutrition and limited medical care available in detention, would have taken its toll on a 78-year-old body. But Vincent also had one advantage: his reputation. Even in federal detention, even facing life in prison, Vincent was still a made member of the Bonanno family, still someone who commanded respect in the criminal world. Other inmates knew who he was, knew what he represented, and treated him accordingly. In the social order of prisons and jails, authentic mobsters, especially old-school guys like Vincent, occupy a high position. As 2014 turned into 2015, Vincent waited for his trial date. Legal proceedings moved slowly, with motions filed, hearings held, evidence reviewed, and strategies debated. Each side was preparing their case, gathering witnesses, reviewing documents, making arguments. For Vincent, this waiting period must have been agonizing. His freedom, his reputation, his entire life were on the line. He was facing the very real possibility that he would be convicted and would die in federal prison. And all of this was happening because his own son and cousin had broken the code he had lived by his entire life. The question that must have haunted Vincent during these months was whether the code had been worth it. He had stayed silent, had never cooperated, had kept his loyalty to the organization even when it meant facing serious charges. But what had that loyalty bought him? His son had flipped. His cousin had flipped. The organization itself was full of informants and cooperators. Was he the last true believer in a code that had already died? Or was keeping the code standing up, refusing to rat, was that itself the point? Was Vincent's identity so tied up in being a man of honor, someone who lived by the old rules, that cooperation was literally unthinkable regardless of the consequences? As the trial date approached, Vincent would have the opportunity to find out whether a jury would believe he was a hardened criminal deserving of life in prison, or whether reasonable doubt and the questionable credibility of cooperating witnesses would allow him to go free. After more than 7 decades of living by the code, Vincent Asaro was about to face the ultimate test. On October 19, 2015, the trial of Vincent Asaro began in federal court in Brooklyn. The courtroom was packed with journalists, police officials, members of the public, and representatives from various news organizations. This was the trial everyone had been waiting for, the real-life Goodfella, finally facing justice for crimes that had captured the public imagination for decades. The Honorable Alan Ross presided over the trial, a federal judge known for her fairness and her ability to manage complex cases. The prosecution team was led by experienced prosecutors from the Eastern District of New York attorneys who had built careers putting mobsters behind bars. The defense was led by lawyers skilled in criminal defense and intimately familiar with the strategies needed to defend organized crime cases. Vincent, now 80 years old, sat at the defense table wearing a suit, looking like someone's grandfather rather than a feared mobster. This appearance was on purpose. The defense wanted the jury to see an old man, not a monster. Throughout the trial, Vincent kept a calm manner, occasionally whispering to his attorneys, but showing no obvious emotion as witnesses testified against him. The prosecutor's opening statement painted Vincent as a gangster through and through. They told the story of a man who had chosen a life of crime at an early age, who had taken part in murder, robbery, extortion, and other crimes spanning more than half a century. They described him as an active participant in the Bonanno crime family, someone who had earned his position through violence and threats. The prosecutors outlined the evidence they would present: testimony from cooperating witnesses who had taken part in crimes with Vincent, recorded conversations that showed his involvement in criminal activities, physical evidence including the remains of Paul Katz, and documentary evidence showing patterns of criminal conduct. They described the Lufthansa robbery in detail, explaining Vincent's alleged role in planning and profiting from the robbery. They explained the murder of Paul Katz, describing how Vincent and others had strangled him with a dog chain and buried his body, where it remained hidden for more than 40 years. They described various extortion schemes, acts of violence, and other criminal activities that showed Vincent's continuing involvement in organized crime well into his 70s. The prosecution's theory was simple. Vincent Asaro was a career criminal who had escaped justice for decades, but whose crimes had finally caught up with him. The evidence was overwhelming, the witnesses were credible, and justice demanded that Vincent finally be held responsible for his actions. The defense's opening statement took a very different approach. Vincent's attorney admitted that yes, his client knew criminals. Yes, he had grown up in a world where organized crime was common. Yes, he had made mistakes and poor choices. But knowing criminals wasn't the same as being a criminal. And even if Vincent had been involved in some illegal activities, that didn't mean he was guilty of these specific charges. The defense focused particularly on the credibility of the cooperating witnesses. These were admitted criminals, people who had committed serious crimes and who had made deals with prosecutors to reduce their own sentences. They had every incentive to tell prosecutors what they wanted to hear to exaggerate Vincent's role, to implicate him in crimes he didn't commit. Could you really trust the word of Vincent's son, who had betrayed his own father to save himself? Could you trust a cousin who had turned informant? Regarding the Lufthansa robbery, the defense argued that the evidence connecting Vincent to the robbery was weak and circumstantial. Yes, Vincent knew people who were involved, Yes, he lived in Queens near where the robbery occurred. But where was the physical evidence? Where were the reliable witnesses? After 37 years, after all the investigation and all the publicity, the government still couldn't prove that Vincent had taken part in the robbery. The defense's strategy was to create reasonable doubt, to show that while Vincent might not be a chore boy, the prosecution hadn't proven beyond a reasonable doubt that he was guilty of these specific charges. In America, you couldn't convict someone just because they seemed like the type of person who might have committed a crime. You needed proof, real evidence, credible witnesses. And the defense argued that the prosecution didn't have those things. The heart of the prosecution's case was the testimony of cooperating witnesses, primarily Jerome Asaro and Gaspar Valenti. For several days, the courtroom was riveted as Vincent's own son took the stand and testified against him. Jerome's testimony was detailed and damaging. He described growing up in the life, learning from his father how organized crime operated, taking part in various criminal activities alongside Vincent. He testified about specific crimes, specific conversations, specific instances where Vincent had shown his role in the Bonanno family. Most dramatically, Jerome testified about the murder of Paul Katz. He described how Vincent had told him about the killing, about strangling cats with a dog chain, about burying the body. He testified about conversations where Vincent had discussed the Lufthansa robbery, about Vincent's share of the money, about how the robbery had been planned and carried out. The cross-examination of Jerome was fierce. The defense attorney hammered away at his credibility, his motivations, his history of lies and criminal conduct. How many crimes had Jerome committed? How many times had he lied to investigators? What deal had he made with prosecutors in exchange for his testimony? How much prison time was he avoiding by testifying against his father? Jerome admitted to being a criminal, admitted to lying in the past, admitted that he was testifying in part to help himself. But he maintained that his testimony about Vincent was truthful, that he had direct knowledge of his father's crimes, that he was finally telling the truth after years of living by the code of silence. The jury watched this testimony with visible discomfort. A son testifying against his father broke basic ideas of family loyalty. But this was also powerful testimony, detailed, specific, from someone who had intimate knowledge of Vincent's activities. The jury would have to decide, was Jerome a credible witness despite his obvious flaws? Or had he made up or exaggerated his testimony to serve his own interests? Gaspar Valenti's testimony followed a similar pattern. He described decades of criminal activity with Vincent-specific crimes, specific conversations, specific instances of Vincent's involvement in organized crime. The defense cross-examination attacked his credibility just as fiercely, pointing out his criminal history, his deal with prosecutors, his motivation to lie. The prosecution played numerous recorded conversations featuring Vincent. These recordings had been made through court-approved wiretaps and listening devices, capturing Vincent's conversations in various locations over several years. The recordings showed Vincent discussing various criminal activities, though never in explicit detail. He talked about work and business in ways that the prosecution argued were clearly references to criminal activities. He discussed earning and paying tribute using the language of the mafia. He made references to past crimes and current operations that the prosecution argued showed his ongoing involvement in organized crime. The defense countered that the recordings were unclear, that they could be interpreted in different ways, that Vincent was an old man telling stories and sometimes exaggerating his importance. The defense argued that tough talk wasn't the same as actual criminal conduct, that you couldn't convict someone based on vague references and criminal slang. One particularly powerful moment came when the prosecution played a recording of Vincent discussing Paul Katz's murder. Vincent could be heard making a reference to the killing, speaking in indirect terms, but in a way that prosecutors argued clearly showed his knowledge of and participation in the crime. The defense argued that Vincent had merely heard about the murder from others and was discussing it as a piece of criminal lore rather than admitting his own involvement. The prosecution presented the remains of Paul Katz, which had been discovered in 2013 at the location where cooperating witnesses said the body had been buried. Forensic experts testified about the identification of the remains, the cause of death, and the estimated time of death. The evidence backed up the witnesses' testimony. Katz had been murdered in 1969 and buried exactly where the witnesses said he had been buried. The defense admitted that Paul Katz had been murdered, but argued that the prosecution hadn't proven that Vincent was involved. Yes, the body was found where witnesses said it would be, but that only proved that the witnesses knew where the body was buried. It didn't prove that Vincent had taken part in the murder. Witnesses who wanted to implicate Vincent might have known about the murder from other sources and were falsely claiming Vincent's involvement to help their own cases. Regarding the Lufthansa robbery, the prosecution had very little physical evidence. The money had never been recovered. No fingerprints or forensic evidence connected Vincent to the robbery. The prosecution's case rested almost entirely on the testimony of cooperating witnesses who claimed Vincent had told them about his involvement. This was a significant weakness in the case. After decades of investigation, after all the resources dedicated to solving this famous crime, the government still couldn't present concrete, physical evidence of Vincent's participation. The prosecution called FBI agents who had investigated Vincent for years, who could testify about his role in the Bonanno family, his criminal associations, and the patterns of conduct that showed his involvement in organized crime. These agents described surveillance operations, explained mafia organizational structure, and provided context for the recorded conversations and witness testimony. The defense called its own experts, including former police officials who raised questions about the investigation's methods and the reliability of cooperating witness testimony. They also called character witnesses, people who had known Vincent for years, who described him as a family man, a neighbor, someone who helped people in the community. These witnesses painted a picture very different from the prosecution's portrayal of Vincent as a ruthless criminal. The contrast was stark. Was Vincent Asaro a vicious mobster who had murdered, robbed, and extorted his way through life? Or was he an old man from Queens who knew some bad people, but who wasn't personally guilty of these specific crimes? Several witnesses testified specifically about the Lufthansa robbery. Some had taken part in the robbery and later worked with authorities. Others had heard Vincent discuss his involvement. The testimony painted a picture of Vincent as an important player in the robbery, helping plan, providing people, and receiving a share of the money, but the defense highlighted inconsistencies in the testimony. Different witnesses gave different accounts of exactly what Vincent's role had been. Some said he was directly involved in planning. Others said his involvement was more on the edges. The amounts of money he allegedly received varied between different accounts. And crucially, none of the witnesses could point to any physical evidence, no documents, no photographs, no recovered money that definitively proved Vincent's participation. The defense also noted that some of the witnesses testifying about Lufthansa had not come forward until decades after the robbery, only providing information once they themselves faced criminal charges and needed to make deals with prosecutors. This raised questions about whether their testimony was genuine memory or was instead what they thought prosecutors wanted to hear. One of the most important decisions in any criminal trial is whether the defendant will testify. Vincent had the constitutional right to remain silent, and the prosecution couldn't comment on or hold it against him if he chose not to take the stand. But juries often want to hear from defendants, want to hear their version of events, their denials of the charges. Vincent chose not to testify. This decision was almost certainly made on the advice of his attorneys, who would have recognized that Vincent taking the stand would expose him to potentially devastating cross-examination. Prosecutors would have been able to ask him about his entire criminal history, about his association with known criminals, about inconsistencies in his story. A skilled prosecutor could potentially get Vincent to admit to criminal conduct, or to make statements that would undermine his defense by not testifying. Vincent kept his right to silence, forcing the prosecution to prove their case without any help from him. But it also meant the jury never heard Vincent's own words in his defense, never heard him deny the charges directly, never got to evaluate his credibility firsthand. The defense argued that Vincent's decision not to testify should be respected and not held against him. It was his constitutional right, and the burden of proof remained on the prosecution to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Regardless of whether Vincent testified, after several weeks of testimony, both sides presented their closing arguments, their final opportunity to persuade the jury before discussions began. The prosecution's closing argument emphasized the weight of evidence against Vincent. They had multiple witnesses who testified about his crimes. They had recordings of Vincent discussing criminal activities. They had the physical remains of Paul Katz, found exactly where witnesses said they would be. They had evidence of Vincent's role in the Bonanno family, his decades of criminal conduct, his participation in some of the most notorious crimes in American history. The prosecutors argued that the cooperating witnesses, despite their flaws, were telling the truth. Why would Jerome Asaro lie about his own father? Why would multiple witnesses independently tell the same stories about Vincent's crimes? The consistency of the testimony, combined with the physical and recorded evidence, proved Vincent's guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. The defense's closing argument focused on reasonable doubt. They reminded the jury that the prosecution had to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, not just that Vincent probably committed these crimes, but that the evidence was so strong that there was no reasonable doubt about his guilt. The defense argued that the cooperating witnesses were not credible. These were criminals who had made deals to reduce their own sentences. They had every reason to lie, to exaggerate, to tell prosecutors what they wanted to hear. The fact that Jerome was Vincent's son didn't make his testimony more credible. If anything, it showed how low Jerome would sink to help himself. The defense pointed out the lack of physical evidence for the Lufthansa robbery. After all these years, after all the investigation, the government still couldn't prove Vincent's involvement. They had suspicions, they had theories, they had testimony from dubious witnesses, but they didn't have proof. The defense argued that even if Vincent had been involved in some criminal activities, that didn't make him guilty of these specific charges. The prosecution had to prove each charge separately beyond a reasonable doubt, and the defense argued that they had failed to do so. Judge Ross gave the jury detailed instructions about the law they should apply. She explained the concept of reasonable doubt, the burden of proof on the prosecution, the elements that had to be proven for each charge. She instructed them on how to evaluate witness credibility, how to consider cooperating witness testimony, how to assess the evidence as a whole. The jury then retired to discuss. They would review the evidence, discuss the testimony, debate the credibility of witnesses, and ultimately decide, had the prosecution proven Vincent Asaro's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt? For Vincent, the waiting was agonizing. His entire life hung in the balance. At 80 years old, a guilty verdict on any of the major charges would be a life sentence. He would die in prison, his reputation destroyed, his legacy one of a criminal who had finally been caught and punished. But if the jury acquitted him, if they found reasonable doubt, then Vincent would walk free. He would have beaten the system, would have proven that even with cooperating witnesses and decades of investigation, the government couldn't convict him. He would prove right the code of silence he had lived by, would show that staying loyal, never cooperating, could actually work even in the modern era. the jury discussed for several days. News of the trial had spread widely, and the nation waited to see how this remarkable case would resolve. Would justice finally catch up with Vincent Asaro? Or would he and probably walk free despite all the evidence against him? On November 12, 2015, the jury announced they had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled quickly with journalists, police officials, lawyers, and members of the public who had been following the trial. Vincent, now having spent nearly 2 years in custody, was brought from the detention center to hear the judgment that would determine the rest of his life. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Prosecutors sat confidently at their table. They had presented what they believed was overwhelming evidence of Vincent's guilt. The defense attorneys tried to appear calm, but they knew that acquittals in RICO cases against mobsters were extremely rare. Vincent himself showed little emotion, keeping the stoic manner he had shown throughout the trial. The jury foreman stood and announced the verdicts. Racketeering, not guilty. Murder, Paul Katz, not guilty. Robbery, Lufthansa robbery, not guilty. The courtroom erupted. Prosecutors sat in stunned silence, unable to believe what they had just heard. After years of investigation, after building what they thought was an unbreakable case, the jury had rejected their arguments completely. Vincent's attorneys embraced him, celebrating a victory that seemed almost impossible. Vincent himself, according to courtroom observers, showed emotion for the first time during the trial: relief, joy, disbelief. At 80 years old, after facing charges that should have sent him to prison for life, he had been found not guilty on all major counts. The verdict shocked almost everyone who had followed the trial. Legal experts had predicted conviction. Police had been confident in their case. The media had been preparing stories about Vincent's conviction and the closing of the Lufthansa case after 37 years. But the jury had seen things differently. In interviews after the trial, some jurors explained their reasoning. They had found the cooperating witnesses, particularly York Asaro and Gaspar Valente, to be not credible. These were admitted criminals who had made deals with prosecutors. Their testimony was too self-serving, too convenient, too uncorroborated by physical evidence. The jurors noted that Jerome had every reason to lie about his father to save himself from a long prison sentence. They questioned why, if Vincent had really discussed these crimes so openly with his son and cousin, there wasn't more evidence of his involvement. They found reasonable doubt in the lack of physical evidence, particularly regarding the Lufthansa robbery. One juror was quoted as saying that while Vincent might not be a choir boy, the prosecution hadn't proven beyond a reasonable doubt that he was guilty of these specific crimes. Another said they couldn't convict someone based primarily on the word of criminals who were testifying to help themselves. The verdict was a stunning rejection of the prosecution's case and a proof of Vincent's strategy of keeping silence and fighting the charges rather than accepting a plea deal. Prosecution was devastated. They had dedicated years to building this case, had put together what they believed was overwhelming evidence, had finally brought charges in the famous Lufthansa robbery that had escaped police for decades, and the jury had rejected it all. In a statement after the verdict, prosecutors maintained that they believed Vincent was guilty, that the evidence supported conviction, but that they respected the jury's decision. They admitted that convincing a jury beyond a reasonable doubt was always challenging, particularly when dealing with crimes that occurred decades ago, and evidence that relied heavily on cooperating witness testimony. The FBI, which had investigated Vincent for decades, was equally disappointed. Agents who had worked on the case felt that justice had not been served, that a dangerous criminal had escaped responsibility for serious crimes, including murder. But they too admitted that the criminal justice system requires proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And in this case, the jury had found such doubt. For Vincent's defense team, the verdict was a tremendous professional victory. Winning an acquittal in a RICO case against a mobster was extremely rare. The defense had successfully attacked the credibility of the prosecution's witnesses, had highlighted the lack of physical evidence, and had created sufficient reasonable doubt in the jury's mind. Vincent's lead attorney gave a statement outside the courthouse, arguing that justice had been served, that his client was innocent of these charges, and that the verdict showed the importance of requiring the government to meet its burden of proof. He portrayed the verdict not just as a victory for Vincent, but as a proof of the American justice system and its protection of defendants' rights. After the verdict, Vincent was released from custody. He walked out of the federal courthouse in Brooklyn, a free man, something that had seemed impossible just hours before. Photographers captured images of an 80-year-old man looking frail but relieved, leaving the courthouse accompanied by his attorneys. For Vincent, the moment must have been surreal. He had faced life in prison, had been prepared to die behind bars, had spent nearly 2 years in federal detention waiting for trial. Now suddenly he was free. The charges that should have ended his life with a conviction had instead resulted in complete acquittal. News of the verdict spread quickly. The story was covered extensively in New York media and picked up by national news outlets. "Mobster acquitted in Lufthansa robbery," read the headlines. Legal experts and crime commentators debated the verdict, with some praising the jury's following of the reasonable doubt standard and others criticizing what they saw as the jury's failure to hold a dangerous criminal responsible. The verdict had broader effects for organized crime prosecutions. It showed that even with cooperating witnesses, even with years of investigation, even in a case as famous as the Lufthansa robbery, convictions were not guaranteed. It showed that juries could be skeptical of cooperating witness testimony, particularly when those witnesses were criminals with obvious motivations to lie. For the Mafia, the verdict was seen as a rare victory in an era when the organization had suffered mostly defeats. Vincent had beaten the system, had proven that the old code of silence could still work even in the modern era of cooperation and electronic surveillance. He had stayed loyal, had never flipped, and had walked free while his son and cousin, who had cooperated, would forever be marked as rats. But the victory came at a cost. Vincent had spent nearly 2 years in custody. His reputation, while perhaps enhanced in certain criminal circles, was now permanently public. Everyone knew who he was and what he had been accused of. His relationship with his son was presumably destroyed beyond repair, and he had been through the stress and trauma of a major criminal trial that might have been avoided if he had chosen to cooperate. The question that fascinated legal observers was what exactly had convinced the jury to acquit. While some jurors spoke to media after the trial, the full discussion process remained private. Several factors seemed to have influenced the verdict. Witness credibility. The jury apparently found the cooperating witnesses, particularly Jerome and Gasper, to be not sufficiently credible. Their status as criminals making deals with prosecutors undermined their testimony. Lack of physical evidence, particularly for the Lufthansa robbery. The absence of any physical evidence connecting Vincent to the crime created reasonable doubt. Testimony alone from dubious witnesses wasn't enough. Age and presentation. Vincent's appearance as a frail 80-year-old man may have made it difficult for jurors to see him as the dangerous criminal prosecutors described. The disconnect between Vincent's current appearance and the crimes he was accused of committing decades earlier may have created psychological distance. Burden of proof. The jury took seriously their duty to find proof beyond a reasonable doubt. In a system that protects defendants' rights, even strong suspicion of guilt isn't enough for conviction. The prosecution must prove each element of each charge, beyond a reasonable doubt. Time. The passage of decades since the alleged crimes made some evidence less reliable. Memories fade. Physical evidence disappears. Witnesses die. The jury may have felt that trying to judge crimes committed 40-plus years earlier was inherently problematic. After his acquittal, Vincent returned to his home in Queens. He had beaten charges that should have been unbeatable. He had survived when everyone expected him to die in prison. He had proven right the code of silence in an era when that code seemed outdated. In some ways, Vincent had become exactly what the trial had portrayed him as: the last Goodfella, the last of the old-school mobsters who lived by the traditional code and somehow improbably made it work. He had outlived or outlasted most of his generation. He had survived his own son's betrayal, and he had walked out of federal court a free man at age 80. But Vincent's story was far from over. Freedom came with conditions, and old habits die hard, especially for a man who had spent his entire life as a mobster. The question was whether Vincent could stay out of trouble, could live quietly in his remaining years, or whether his temperament and his lifetime of criminal behavior would lead him back into the system. The answer wouldn't take long to emerge. Walking out of federal court, a free man after being acquitted of murder, robbery, and racketeering should have been the end of Vincent Asaro's story. At 80 years old, having narrowly escaped spending his final years in prison, most people would have been grateful for a second chance and determined to live out their remaining days quietly and legally. But Vincent Asaro was not most people. His entire adult life had been defined by being a mobster. He had taken in the values, attitudes, and behaviors of that world so completely that they had become inseparable from his identity. The respect he commanded, the fear he inspired, the sense of power and authority he felt, these were not things he could simply turn off like a switch. And his temperament, quick to anger, intolerant of disrespect, prone to confrontation, had served him well in the criminal world, but would prove to be his downfall in his brief period of freedom. In the months immediately following his acquittal, Vincent likely experienced a mixture of emotions: relief at having avoided prison, certainly; pride at having beaten the system and proven right the code of silence; perhaps satisfaction at proving that an old-school mobster could still prevail against modern police; but also possibly a sense of aimlessness. What does a lifelong criminal do when the world knows who he is? When police is surely watching his every move? When any misstep could lead back to prison? On March 7, 2017, a little more than a year after his acquittal, Vincent was driving through Queens when he became involved in a traffic dispute. The details are somewhat argued, but the basic facts are these: another driver cut Vincent off or otherwise disrespected him in traffic. Vincent, true to his temperament, didn't let it go. What followed was an act of stunning stupidity for someone who had just escaped life in prison. According to prosecutors, Vincent followed the other driver, confronted him, and in a fit of rage, set the man's car on fire. The incident was captured on surveillance cameras. The evidence was clear and undeniable. Vincent, the man who had just beaten multiple serious charges through careful argumentation about reasonable doubt and witness credibility, had committed a crime in full view of security cameras. The arson was a federal crime because it involved interstate commerce. The car had crossed state lines. The FBI, surely delighted to have another chance at Vincent, quickly built a case. This time there would be no cooperating witnesses to attack, no complex crimes from decades ago to create reasonable doubt about. There was video evidence of Vincent committing a serious crime, period. Vincent's behavior raises fascinating questions about psychology and criminal behavior. Why would someone who had just escaped life in prison immediately commit another serious crime? Several explanations are possible. Impulse control. At 81 years old, Vincent may have had diminished impulse control due to age-related cognitive changes. The rage he felt at being disrespected in traffic overcame any rational consideration of consequences. Identity. Being a mobster was so central to Vincent's identity that he literally couldn't behave any other way. Disrespect had to be answered. Slights had to be punished. Respect had to be maintained. These were automatic responses, not conscious choices. Invincibility. Having beaten the Lufthansa case and the murder charge, Vincent may have felt invincible, believing he could get away with anything. His acquittal may have reinforced a sense that the rules didn't apply to him. Defiance. Vincent may have been consciously or unconsciously defying the system that had tried to imprison him by committing another crime so soon after his acquittal. He was essentially saying, "I am what I am, and I'm not going to change for anyone." The code. In the Mafia's value system, disrespect cannot be tolerated. Someone who disrespects you and gets away with it makes you look weak, which invites further disrespect. Vincent may have felt that allowing the traffic incident to pass without response would have undermined his reputation and status, whatever the explanation. The result was clear. Vincent's freedom would be short-lived. The FBI arrested Vincent and charged him with arson. Unlike the previous case, this was straightforward. There was video evidence. There were witnesses. There was no way to create reasonable doubt about whether Vincent had committed the crime. Vincent's attorneys likely advised him that going to trial was pointless. The evidence was overwhelming. No jury would acquit in the face of such clear proof. The only question was what sentence he would receive. In 2017, Vincent pleaded guilty to the arson charge. By pleading guilty, he avoided a trial and potentially received some consideration for accepting responsibility. But he also guaranteed that he would return to prison, this time with no realistic hope of acquittal or early release. The federal sentencing guidelines for arson were serious. Vincent faced potentially years in prison. And unlike the previous charges where he could argue that he was being persecuted for old crimes and associational guilt, this was a clear-cut case of Vincent committing a serious violent crime for no good reason. At his sentencing hearing, Vincent's attorneys argued for leniency based on his age and health. They portrayed the arson as an aberration, a momentary lapse in judgment by an old man who had lost his temper. They emphasized that no one had been hurt, that Vincent had accepted responsibility by pleading guilty, that imprisoning an 82-year-old man served no useful purpose. The prosecution argued for a significant sentence, pointing out that Vincent had just been acquitted of serious charges and had immediately returned to criminal behavior. They argued that leniency would send the wrong message, that even after being given a second chance, Vincent had chosen to continue his life of crime. They noted that the arson could easily have resulted in serious injury or death if someone had been in the car or if the fire had spread. Judge sentenced Vincent to 8 years in federal prison. At 82 years old, this was essentially a life sentence. Even with good time credits, Vincent would be in his late 80s or early 90s before release would be possible. Given his age and declining health, it was quite possible he would die in prison. The sentencing marked a stunning reversal of fortune. Just 2 years earlier, Vincent had walked out of court a free man, having beaten charges that should have put him away for life. Now, because of his own actions, his own inability to control his temper and leave his criminal behavior behind, he was returning to prison, potentially for the rest of his life. Vincent's return to prison so soon after his acquittal sparked considerable commentary. Legal experts noted the irony of beating serious charges only to immediately commit another crime. Psychologists discussed the difficulty of changing behavior patterns that have been reinforced over a lifetime. Criminologists pointed to Vincent as an example of why most career criminals can't successfully transition to law-abiding life, especially later in life, for those who knew Vincent or had followed his case. The arson incident confirmed what many had suspected. Vincent was a criminal through and through, incapable of changing even when faced with the strongest possible incentives. His identity, his values, his automatic responses were all shaped by decades in the criminal world. Asking him to behave like a law-abiding citizen was like asking a fish to live out of water. It simply wasn't possible. The incident also provided proof of a sort for the prosecutors who had failed to convict Vincent in the earlier trial. They had argued that Vincent was a dangerous criminal who posed a threat to society. The jury had disagreed, finding reasonable doubt about the specific charges. But Vincent's post-acquittal behavior suggested that the prosecutor's general characterization had been correct. He was indeed a criminal. And given freedom, he had quickly returned to criminal behavior. Vincent entered federal prison in 2017 to begin serving his 8-year sentence. He was assigned to a federal correctional facility appropriate for an elderly inmate with health issues. These facilities, while still prisons, were generally less harsh than higher security institutions, with accommodations for older inmates' medical needs. But prison at any security level is difficult, especially for someone in their 80s. Vincent faced a daily routine of regimentation, lack of privacy, limited contact with family, poor food, and the stress of living in an environment designed for punishment rather than comfort. His health, already declining, would only worsen in prison. Age-related conditions would progress without the kind of medical care available outside prison. The stress of incarceration would take its toll. And Vincent faced the very real possibility that he would die in prison, that his last breaths would come in a prison hospital or infirmary rather than at home surrounded by family. The question was whether Vincent felt any regret about his choices. Did he wish he had controlled his temper, had let the traffic incident go, had prioritized his freedom over his pride? Or did he feel that he had acted as a man should act, that disrespect couldn't be tolerated regardless of the consequences, that living free but acting weak would have been worse than returning to prison? Those who knew Vincent suggested he likely felt no regret. The code by which he had lived his entire life didn't allow for regret or second guessing. You did what you had to do. You accepted the consequences, and you didn't cry about it afterward. Vincent had made his choice, had acted according to his nature and his values, and now he would pay the price. That was how the life worked. And so Vincent Asaro, the last Goodfella, the man who had beaten the Lufthansa case and survived his own son's betrayal, returned to federal prison at age 82. The freedom he had fought so hard to maintain had lasted barely a year. The second chance he had been given had been wasted in a moment of rage over a trivial traffic incident. But Vincent's story still had one more chapter to be written, a chapter that would be shaped by a global pandemic, declining health, and the ultimate question: where does a man like Vincent Asaro end his days? When Vincent entered federal prison in 2017, he likely expected to serve most or all of his 8-year sentence behind bars. At his age and with his health conditions, that almost certainly meant he would die in prison. But in early 2020, an event occurred that no one could have predicted. The COVID-19 pandemic swept across the world, and prisons became particularly dangerous places for elderly inmates. With health issues, the virus spread rapidly through correctional facilities where social distancing was impossible and where adequate medical care was often lacking. Elderly inmates with underlying health conditions were at particular risk, exactly the category that Vincent fell into. News reports detailed outbreaks in federal prisons, with inmates dying from COVID-19 complications at alarming rates. In response to the crisis, the Bureau of Prisons began releasing certain elderly, non-violent inmates to home confinement under compassionate release provisions. The idea was to reduce prison populations and protect the most vulnerable inmates from a disease that was proven particularly deadly for their demographic. But Vincent had another health crisis beyond COVID-19. In 2019, he suffered a stroke while in prison. The stroke left him partially paralyzed and caused aphasia, a condition affecting his ability to speak and communicate. For a man who had spent his life talking, negotiating, giving orders, The loss of speech must have been particularly devastating. The combination of advanced age, Vincent was now 85. Serious health conditions, including the stroke and its lingering effects, and the COVID-19 pandemic created a situation where Vincent's attorneys could argue for compassionate release. They petitioned the court, arguing that keeping Vincent in prison essentially amounted to a death sentence, that he posed no threat to society in his current condition, and that humanitarian considerations demanded his release. In 2020, a federal judge granted Vincent's request for compassionate release. After serving approximately 3 years of his 8-year sentence, Vincent was released from federal prison to home confinement. He would spend his remaining years not in a prison cell but in his home in Queens, under supervision, but technically free. The release was controversial. Prosecutors had argued for keeping Vincent incarcerated, pointing out that he had just been given a second chance after his 2015 acquittal and had immediately returned to criminal behavior. They argued that compassionate release should be reserved for truly sympathetic cases, not for career criminals who had made poor choices their entire lives. But the judge apparently concluded that humanitarian considerations outweighed punitive concerns. Vincent was elderly, seriously ill, posed minimal threat to public safety in his current condition, and was at high risk from COVID-19 if he remained in prison. Whatever his past crimes, keeping him imprisoned during a pandemic when he could be safely supervised at home seemed unnecessarily cruel. Vincent's release under these circumstances provided a kind of unclear ending to his criminal career. He hadn't beaten the system exactly. He had been convicted and imprisoned, but he also hadn't served his full sentence. He had been released early due to circumstances beyond anyone's control. He would spend his final years in his own home rather than in a prison cell. But under continuing federal supervision, the world Vincent returned to in 2020 was dramatically different from the world he had known. The COVID-19 pandemic had shut down much of normal life. People wore masks, avoided social contact, lived in fear of an invisible virus. The neighborhoods of Queens he had known his entire life were quieter, more isolated, more fearful. More fundamentally, the world of organized crime he had known was essentially extinct. The Bonanno family still existed technically, but it was a shadow of what it had been in Vincent's youth. Federal prosecutions, RICO cases, and the erosion of Omerta had decimated the ranks of the 5 families. Young Italian Americans were no longer interested in joining the mafia. They had access to real opportunities their grandfathers could only have dreamed of. The code that Vincent had lived by, the code of silence. Loyalty and honor among thieves was effectively dead. Modern criminals worked with authorities as a matter of course, making rational calculations about self-interest rather than following abstract principles. The romantic notion of the honorable gangster, the made man who lived by a code, had been replaced by the reality of criminals who talked to save themselves and their families. Vincent, in his diminished state, was a relic from another era. The stroke had robbed him of much of his ability to communicate. His partially paralyzed body was a shell of the robust man he had once been. He couldn't really take part in criminal activities, even if he wanted to. He was simply an old man living out his final years under federal supervision, waiting for the end. From 2020 to 2023, Vincent lived quietly in Queens. The specific details of these years are not publicly known. A man in home confinement under federal supervision doesn't make news unless he violates the terms of his release. The silence around these years suggests Vincent finally lived. Without incident, his days of crime and violence finally behind him. He presumably spent time with family members who were willing to associate with him, family whose relationships hadn't been destroyed by his criminal life and the publicity of his trials. He likely reflected on his life, though with his aphasia, he couldn't easily share those reflections with others. He experienced the ongoing effects of his stroke. The gradual decline of his body as age and illness took their inevitable toll in many ways. These 3 years might have been the quietest, most peaceful years of Vincent's adult life. No criminal activities, no police surveillance, numbered trials or legal proceedings, just an old man living his final days, probably watched over by family, receiving medical care for his various conditions, existing rather than truly living. But even in these quiet years, Vincent remained who he had always been. Whatever his physical limitations, whatever his inability to communicate effectively, Vincent was still Vincent Asaro, the last Goodfella, the man who had lived by the code even when everyone around him abandoned it, the survivor who had outlasted most of his generation. On October 22, 2023, Vincent Asaro died. Reports vary on his exact age. Some sources say 86, others 88. This uncertainty about even his birth year is fitting for a man who spent his life in the shadows, whose true story was always somewhat hidden by rumor, secrecy, and the code of silence. The cause of death was not immediately made public, but given his age and health conditions, the stroke, the partial paralysis, the various ailments that come with being in one's late 80s, it's likely he died of natural causes, his body simply giving out after nearly 9 decades of life. Vincent's lawyer, commenting on his death, said, "He had 9 lives. This must have been the 10th. The comment captured something essential about Vincent's life. He had survived when so many others hadn't. He had beaten charges that should have convicted him. He had lived to a remarkable age despite living a life that typically ends in early death or long imprisonment." Vincent's funeral was held at St. Helens Church in Queens, the same neighborhood where he had grown up and where he had spent most of his life. It was a traditional Catholic funeral service, the kind of service that countless Italian Americans had had before him. The funeral was likely attended by family members, old friends, perhaps some surviving members of his crew and the Bonanno family. There would have been the usual rituals, the viewing, the mass, the procession to the cemetery. Vincent would have been buried in the traditional way, his body returned to the earth, his life commemorated with prayers and eulogies. But the funeral would also have been shadowed by Vincent's reputation and the publicity surrounding his life. How do you eulogize a man who is accused of murder? How do you celebrate a life spent largely in criminal activity? How do you reconcile the man family members knew, the father, grandfather, neighbor, with the public persona of Vincent Asaro, the mobster? The answer is that you probably focus on the personal, the human details. You talk about family memories, personal kindnesses, the aspects of Vincent's life that existed apart from his criminal activities. You admit that he wasn't perfect, that he made mistakes, but you also celebrate what was good in him, and you leave the judgment of his life to higher powers. With Vincent's death, something ended. He was one of the last direct links to the era shown in Goodfellas, to the world of 1970s and 1980s, organized crime that had captured public imagination. The men who had been active in that era, Jimmy Burke, Henry Hill, Paul Vario, and countless others, were nearly all dead. Vincent had outlived most of them, had survived through a combination of luck, caution, and loyalty to the code. But Vincent was also the last example of a certain type of mobster, the old-school gangster who truly believed in omerta, who kept silence even when his own son turned informant, who chose to fight charges rather than work with police, even when cooperation might have resulted in leniency. In an era when cooperation had become common, when the code of silence was more ignored than followed, Vincent had stood firm. Whether this made him admirable or simply stubborn is a matter of perspective. From one viewpoint, Vincent was a man of principle who stuck to his code even when it cost him dearly. From another viewpoint, he was a criminal who caused real harm to real people and who simply refused to take responsibility for his actions. The truth, as is often the case, probably lies somewhere in between. Vincent was a product of his time and place, raised in a world where organized crime was normalized, where the values of loyalty and silence were taught from childhood, where the mafia offered opportunities and protections that real society denied to, pushed aside immigrant communities. But he was also a person who made choices to take part in violence, to engage in criminal activities, to continue that life even when other options became available. His death marked the end of an era, not just for him personally, but for the mafia as an institution. The old ways were gone. The code was dead. The 5 families that had once controlled New York's underworld were shadows of their former selves. The romantic notion of the gangster living by a code of honor had been replaced by the funkified by the ordinary reality of criminals cooperating to save themselves. Vincent Asaro was the last Goodfella, not because he was the last member of the mafia, the organization still exists in diminished form, but because he was the last to truly embody the values and attitudes of that bygone era. With his death, that era finally, definitively ended. Vincent Asaro's life was defined by omerta, the code of silence that was the foundation of mafia culture. From his earliest days, Vincent was taught that loyalty to the organization came before everything else. You didn't work with authorities under any circumstances. You didn't discuss family business with outsiders. You accepted punishment rather than betray your partners. This code wasn't just a rule. It was a complete worldview, a way of understanding the world and your place in it. For Vincent, omerta was both salvation and curse. It saved him by making him trustworthy, reliable, someone who could be counted on to keep secrets even under extreme pressure. This trustworthiness was valuable in the criminal world, allowing Vincent to rise through the ranks and keep his position even as others fell. His reputation for silence, his refusal to cooperate even when his own son turned informant, gave him a kind of status and respect that was rare in the modern era. But the code also cursed him. It meant he couldn't make deals when arrests came. It meant he couldn't work with police to reduce his sentences. It meant he watched others who broke the code receive leniency while he, who kept it, faced harsher consequences. Most painfully, it meant he followed a code that the people closest to him, his son, his cousin, ultimately broke when their own interests were at stake. The question that haunted Vincent's life was whether the code was worth the cost. He paid dearly for his loyalty, years in prison, betrayal by family, a life lived in constant danger from both police and criminal rivals. And in the end, the organization he was loyal to was itself dying. The code he kept was increasingly ignored, and the world he had helped build was crumbling. But from Vincent's perspective, the code was probably non-negotiable. It wasn't a cost-benefit calculation. It was about identity, about who he was as a person. To break omerta would have been to cease being Vincent Asaro. Better to die loyal than to live as a rat. It was the core belief that governed his entire life. Vincent came from a family with deep roots in organized crime. His grandfather had been an early member of the Bonanno family. His father had been a mobster. Vincent himself carried on that tradition, making the Asaro name synonymous with the mafia in certain circles. But what happened to that legacy? Vincent's son, Jerome, rather than continuing the family tradition, became an FBI informant and testified against his father. This represented a complete break with the family's history, a rejection of the values and code that had defined the Asaro name for generations. This betrayal must have been particularly painful for Vincent. He had presumably raised Jerome in the code, had taught him the importance of loyalty and silence, had expected him to carry on the family tradition. Instead, Jerome chose self-preservation over family loyalty, cooperation over silence, personal interest over the code. The destruction of the family legacy wasn't just about Jerome's cooperation. It was about the broader fact that the world Vincent's grandfather had helped create no longer existed. The mafia that had been a powerful force in American life for a century was dying. The neighborhoods where organized crime had been accepted and even respected were changing. The younger generation of Italian Americans had opportunities their ancestors lacked and no interest in. Following family members into criminal life, Vincent represented the end of a family line, the last Asaro to truly live by the code. Whatever his relatives do with their lives going forward, they will do so in a world where the Asaro name is associated with criminality and betrayal rather than honor and loyalty. Vincent's legacy within his own family is thus deeply unclear, both a cautionary tale about the cost of criminal life and a story of loyalty, kept even at great personal cost. Despite Vincent's trial, despite decades of investigation, despite all the cooperating witnesses and surveillance technology, the Lufthansa robbery remains one of America's great unsolved mysteries in many respects. Yes, police believes they know who was involved. Yes, charges were brought against Vincent and others. But Vincent was acquitted. The money was never recovered, and many details about the planning and carrying out of the robbery remain unclear. Where did the $6 million go? Some was certainly spent by the robbers on personal expenses, by the mafia on various operations. Some may have been laundered through real businesses. Some may have been hidden in ways that made it untraceable. But the bulk of that money, millions of dollars, simply vanished, never recovered by police. Its fate unknown. This mystery has contributed to the robbery's enduring fascination. It's one thing to solve a crime and recover the stolen property. It's quite another when the criminals seem to have gotten away with it, when the money disappears into the shadows never to be seen again. The Lufthansa robbery represents a kind of perfect crime in the public imagination, bold, successful, and never fully solved. Vincent's acquittal on the Lufthansa charges added another layer to the mystery. If he was involved, and police clearly believed he was, then he took whatever he knew about the robbery to his grave. The secrets of exactly how the robbery was planned, who did what, where the money went, how the operation was coordinated, these remain locked away, protected by omerta even in death. For true crime enthusiasts and amateur investigators, the Lufthansa robbery will continue to fascinate. Books will be written, documentaries will be produced, theories will be debated. And Vincent Asaro will remain a central figure in those discussions, the man who was charged with the crime, who beat those charges, who kept silence about his involvement or non-involvement until his death. Vincent Asaro represented something that no longer exists in American life, the old-school mafia don. The man who lived by a code from another century, who kept values and attitudes that seem almost quaint in the modern era. The 5 families that once controlled New York's underworld have been decimated by RICO prosecutions, cooperating witnesses, and changing demographics. The neighborhoods where the mafia once held sway have changed dramatically. The younger generation has no interest in the life. What killed the traditional mafia wasn't just police pressure, though that was certainly significant. It was broader social changes. Italian Americans who had been pushed aside immigrants when the mafia was founded became mainstream Americans with access to real opportunities. The economic niches the mafia had controlled, unions, gambling, certain industries, changed in ways that reduced the organization's influence. Most importantly, the cultural values that had sustained the mafia, loyalty, silence, respect for hierarchy, eroded as American culture generally became more individualistic. Vincent lived long enough to see this transition complete. The world of his youth, when the mafia was powerful and feared, when omerta was kept, when being a made man meant something significant, that world was gone. He died in a world where the mafia was a shadow of its former self, where cooperation was common, where the code was more historical artifact than living reality. Why figures like Vincent can't exist anymore. Legal evolution. RICO laws allow prosecutors to target entire organizations rather than just individuals. Electronic surveillance has become extremely sophisticated. Asset forfeiture laws make it harder to profit from crimes. These legal tools have made traditional organized crime much more difficult. Cultural changes. The code of silence has broken down. Cooperation with authorities has become normalized, even expected. The social stigma of being an informant has decreased as the practical benefits have become more apparent. Economic opportunities. Real opportunities that were denied to earlier generations of Italian Americans are now available. There's no longer the same economic pressure to turn to organized crime as a path to success. Demographics. The Italian American community has largely moved to suburbs, intermarried with other ethnic groups, and become fully integrated into mainstream American life. The insular ethnic neighborhoods where the mafia flourished no longer exist in the same way. Technology. Modern technology, cell phones, GPS, digital surveillance, forensic analysis makes traditional criminal activity much more risky. The mafia operated effectively in an era of limited police technology. That era is over. Generational change. Each generation of criminals has been less committed to the code than the previous one. By Vincent's time, he was an anomaly, someone who truly believed in and lived by omerta. Even as it became increasingly rare, Vincent couldn't have replicated his life if he were born today. The circumstances that created men like him no longer exist. He was a product of a specific time, place, and culture that has passed into history. In the end, Vincent's life was one of contradictions. He was a criminal but lived by a code. He was loyal but was betrayed. He survived longer than most but ended up imprisoned and broken. He beat major charges but was convicted for a petty crime. He lived in the shadows but became famous through a trial. He kept silence but became a subject of endless speculation and discussion. Was Vincent Asaro a criminal who deserved worse than he got? Or was he a man of principle who kept his honor in a world without it? The answer depends on your perspective and your values. From a police perspective, Vincent was a career criminal who took part in serious crimes including murder. He escaped justice for most of his life and was only held responsible very late. From this viewpoint, his eventual imprisonment was justice delayed but not denied. And he deserved significant punishment for his actions. From a victim's perspective, Paul Katz's family. For instance, Vincent was someone who took a loved one away and helped hide that crime for more than 40 years. No following of a criminal code can justify or excuse such actions. The pain and suffering caused by Vincent's crimes was real and lasting. From a moral perspective, Vincent chose to take part in an organization that caused significant harm to individuals and communities. His loyalty to that organization and its code doesn't free him of responsibility for the results of his choices. The fact that he was raised in that world and taught those values provides explanation, but not excuse. But from another perspective, Vincent was a man who stuck to his principles even when it cost him dearly. He kept loyalty when others didn't. He refused to betray his partners, even when that refusal meant harsher consequences for himself. In a world where most people compromise their principles for personal benefit, Vincent's refusal to do so has a certain integrity, even if the principles themselves were problematic. Perhaps the most accurate assessment is that Vincent was a complex human being who made choices, some admirable in their consistency, some terrible in their results. He lived in a morally gray world and navigated it according to a code that valued loyalty and silence above almost everything else. Whether that code was worth following is ultimately a question each person must answer for themselves. And so ends the story of Vincent Asaro, a man who lived by a code from another century, who survived when everyone around him fell, who was betrayed by his own blood, but never betrayed the life he chose. He died as he lived, quietly in the shadows, leaving behind more questions than answers. Vincent's life spanned nearly 9 decades, from the Great Depression to the digital age. He witnessed the rise and fall of the American Mafia. He took part in some of the most notorious crimes in American history. He survived legal challenges that should have destroyed him. And he kept to the very end the code of silence that defined his identity. Was he a criminal who deserved harsher punishment? Was he a man of principle in a world without honor? Was he a victim of his circumstances and his upbringing? Was he a perpetrator of real harm to real people? The answer is probably all of these things at once. Human beings are complex, and even criminals have dimensions beyond their crimes. Vincent Asaro will be remembered as the last true Goodfella, the last of the old-school mobsters who truly believed in and lived by omerta. Whether this is a legacy to be proud of or ashamed of depends on your values and your perspective. But it is undeniably a significant legacy, one that captures an entire era of American criminal history. The Lufthansa robbery remains one of America's great unsolved mysteries. Despite all the investigations and trials, the money is gone. The secrets are buried with the men who knew them, and the full truth may never be known. Vincent took whatever he knew to his grave, protected by the code of silence, even in death. In the neighborhoods of Queens where Vincent grew up and spent most of his life, things have changed dramatically. The social clubs where mobsters once gathered are gone or converted to other purposes. The restaurants where deals were made have closed or changed ownership. The families that once dominated organized crime have dispersed to suburbs or fallen apart entirely. The world that created Vincent Asaro no longer exists, but the story lives on. Books, documentaries, films, and articles will continue to tell Vincent's story and the story of the world he lived in. New generations will discover the Lufthansa robbery through Goodfellas and will research the real people behind the fictionalized characters. Vincent's trial and acquittal will be studied by law students and criminologists. His following of omerta, in an era of widespread cooperation, will be debated by those interested in criminal culture and psychology. Vincent Asaro was, in the end, a man out of time, someone who kept 19th century Sicilian values in 21st century America, who lived by a code that the modern world no longer recognized or valued, who stood firm even as everything around him changed. Whether this makes him admirable or pitiable, principled or stubborn, is a question without a simple answer. What is clear is that Vincent Asaro represented something that no longer exists in American life. The old mafia, with its rituals and codes and rigid hierarchy, has given way to more fluid forms of organized crime. The Italian-American neighborhoods that once sheltered and sustained the mafia have changed beyond recognition. The cultural values of loyalty and silence have been replaced by more individualistic approaches. Vincent was the last of his kind. And with his death on October 22, 2023, an era truly ended. The last Goodfella had taken his final breath, and the world he represented passed definitively into history. His grave in Queens is unmarked by the notoriety that surrounded his life. He rests among countless other Italian-Americans, immigrants, and their descendants who sought better lives in America. Some of them found those lives through real means. Others, like Vincent, chose a different path. But all of them are now part of history, their stories becoming folklore, their lives reduced to whatever legacy they left behind. Vincent's legacy is complicated and controversial, but it is undeniably significant. He lived through and took part in some of the most fascinating and notorious criminal businesses in American history. He kept principles even when those principles cost him dearly. He outlived his era and his partners, dying in a world that had forgotten the code he lived by. In the end, Vincent Asaro's story is deeply American, a story of immigration and assimilation, of opportunity and crime, of loyalty and betrayal, of old world values colliding with new world realities. It's a story that raises uncomfortable questions about morality, justice, family, and the price we pay for the choices we make. The story of Vincent Asaro ends here. But the questions it raises, the issues it shows, the glimpse it provides into a hidden world, these will endure. And somewhere in Queens, in the neighborhoods where Vincent lived and died, you can still find people who remember the old days, who knew Vincent or knew of him, who watched the world change and the old ways die. They might tell you stories, if you ask the right questions and earn their trust. Stories about what it was really like, about the people who lived that life, about the code that governed their world. But they probably won't tell you everything. Some secrets die with the people who kept them. Some questions never get answered, and maybe that's fitting. Vincent Asaro lived in the shadows. And even in death, some shadows remain. The last Goodfella has passed into legend, taking his secrets with him, leaving behind only the outlines of a story, hints and suggestions of the full truth. If this story kept you here, you're exactly the kind of viewer I create for. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because we've got more incredible true crime stories coming your way, stories of loyalty, betrayal, survival, and the hidden lives that shaped American history. Hit that like button if you learned something new tonight, and share this with someone who loves true crime. These stories matter. They show us the darkness and complexity of the human experience. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and remember, every story has layers we never see. Good night and sleep well.